Welcome back, and thank you for tuning into Cheating Tales Lab. We appreciate every single one of you. We'd love to know, what part of the world are you watching from right now? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's dive into today's story. The metallic clang of surgical instruments echoed through Operating Room 3 at Metropolitan General Hospital. Dr. Abraham Wilkins stood over his patient, his gloved hands steady as they had been for the past 23 years of performing cardiothoracic surgeries. BP's dropping, Dr. Wilkins, the anesthesiologist announced. Abraham's eyes remained fixed on the exposed heart before him. Increase the dopamine drip. Let's get that pressure up. His movements were precise, calculated, a stark contrast to the chaos churning inside his mind. Dr. Lourdes Mansfield, assisting on the other side of the table, noticed the slight tension in his shoulders. She had worked alongside Abraham long enough to read the subtle signs others might miss. 3 hours later, as they scrubbed out, Lourdes broke the silence. "That was close in there. We got it done," Abraham replied, methodically washing his hands. "Your hands were steady as always, Abe, but your mind was somewhere else." Lourdes dried her hands, studying his reflection in the steel sink. "Coffee." In the doctor's lounge, Abraham stared into his cup of black coffee, the events from last night's parent-teacher conference replaying in his mind. 24 hours earlier, the hallways of Westbrook Academy buzzed with activity as parents moved from classroom to classroom. Abraham adjusted his tie, having come straight from the hospital. Rebecca should have been there, but another yoga class had taken priority. Pete Wiggins's classroom smelled of chalk dust and teenage anxiety. The AP chemistry teacher's desk was cluttered with graded papers and half-empty coffee cups. Posters of the periodic table and molecular structures decorated the walls. "Dr. Wilkins." Pete's handshake was firm, his smile too familiar. "Caitlin's one of our brightest students. She definitely inherited those brains from somewhere." "Thank you. Rebecca and I are proud of her dedication." Pete's expression shifted slightly at Rebecca's name. "Ah yes. Mrs. Wilkins mentioned during book club that she's been helping Caitlin with her chemistry studies." Abraham's physician's intuition, honed by decades of reading subtle symptoms, picked up on something in Pete's tone. "Book club? Oh yes." Pete shuffled some papers on his desk. "The one that meets during my free periods on Thursdays. Your wife's quite the literature enthusiast." Rebecca had told him she attended yoga classes on Thursdays. Back in the present, Lourdes' voice cut through his thoughts. "Earth to Abraham. Sorry." He set down his coffee. "Just thinking about something Pete Wiggins said at parent-teacher conferences. The chemistry teacher Caitlin's always talking about?" "The same." Abraham leaned back, his surgical scrubs crinkling. "Did you know Rebecca's apparently in a book club that meets during his free periods?" "I thought she did yoga on Thursdays." "So did I." The silence between them spoke volumes. Clark Sheridan's office was exactly what you'd expect from a former FBI agent turned private investigator. Functional, organized, and completely unremarkable. The man himself matched his surroundings. Mid-50s, gray at the temples, wearing a suit that was practical rather than fashionable. "Tell me everything," Clark said, his notebook open and pen poised. Abraham recounted the inconsistencies he'd noticed. Rebecca's changing schedules, the book club that conflicted with supposed yoga classes, Pete Wiggins's oddly intimate knowledge of his wife's activities. Clark made notes in precise, economical strokes. "How long has your daughter been at Westbrook?" "Since freshman year." 3 years now." "And when did the yoga classes start?" Abraham frowned. "Around the same time." Clark nodded, his expression neutral. "I'll need a few days to establish surveillance and basic background checks. In the meantime, maintain your normal routine. Don't give any indication that you suspect anything." A week later, Clark's preliminary report lay on Abraham's desk at the hospital. Rebecca's yoga studio had no record of her membership. The book club she claimed to attend didn't exist, at least not officially. "Dr. Wilkins?" His office door opened, revealing Janet, one of the nurses. "Your 3 o'clock valve replacement was canceled. The patient's blood work wasn't optimal." Abraham nodded, quickly sliding the report into his drawer. "Thank you, Janet. Could you ask Dr. Mansfield to stop by when she has a moment?" Later that afternoon, Lourdes perched on the edge of his office chair, reading Clark's findings. Jesus, Abe. There's more. He handed her a business card. Wendy Bartlett. The school librarian reached out to Clark yesterday. What did she say? She's been keeping records. Security footage, sign-in sheets, patterns of behavior. Apparently, Pete has a history of close relationships with students' mothers. Lourdes set down the report. Have you talked to Rebecca? Not yet. Clark's gathering more evidence. He says I need to be strategic about this. What about Caitlin? Abraham's face tightened. That's complicated. There are some medical markers in her blood work that never quite made sense. I've always dismissed it, but now, you think. I don't know what to think anymore. The next week passed in a blur of surgeries, surveillance updates, and sleepless nights. Clark's investigation produced a steady stream of evidence. Credit card statements showing purchases at times and places that contradicted Rebecca's stories, security footage from Westbrook Academy showing her car in the parking lot during Pete's free periods, and finally, the damning testimony from Wendy Bartlett. The school librarian sat across from Abraham in Clark's office, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I should have said something sooner, but without proof. Tell him what you saw last Thursday, Clark prompted. Wendy pulled out her phone, fingers trembling slightly as she pulled up a video. I stay late most days, cataloging new acquisitions. My office overlooks the science wing. The footage was grainy but clear enough. Rebecca, entering Pete's classroom after hours. The lights dimming. No one emerging for over an hour. There's more, Clark said quietly. Going back 3 years. Abraham's world tilted on its axis. 3 years. Since Caitlin started at Westbrook, the DNA test results arrived on a Tuesday. Abraham stared at the numbers and percentages that demolished 18 years of fatherhood. His office at Metropolitan General had never felt more sterile, more cold. The drive home that evening was a blur. He barely registered the familiar streets of their upscale neighborhood, the manicured lawns of Oakwood, or the Tudor-style home he had purchased when Caitlin was born. All he could see were the numbers on that report. Rebecca's car was in the driveway. Caitlin's debate practice wouldn't end for another hour, or so he thought. He found Rebecca in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner with practiced precision. She looked up, smiling. You're home early. Rough day? You could say that. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. We need to talk, Rebecca. She set down the knife. What's wrong? Where were you last Thursday afternoon? Yoga class, you know that? Really? Because I have security footage of you entering Pete Wiggins's classroom at 3:45 p.m. The color drained from Rebecca's face. Abe. 3 years, Rebecca. 3 years of lies. It's not what you think. Don't. His hand slammed down on the counter, making the knife rattle. Don't you dare try to explain this away. I have everything. The false yoga classes, the non-existent book club, the money you've been funneling to him. You had me investigated? Her shock turned to anger. How dare you? How dare I? How dare you? 18 years of marriage, Rebecca. 18 years, and Caitlin isn't even mine. The sound of a backpack hitting the floor made them both turn. Caitlin stood in the doorway, her debate team uniform still pristine, her face a mask of horror. Practice ended early, she whispered. Caitlin, honey, Rebecca started. Get out, Abraham said quietly. What? Both Rebecca and Caitlin spoke simultaneously. Get out of my house, Rebecca. Now. Caitlin stepped between them. You can't kick her out. This is her home too. Caitlin, please. Rebecca reached for her daughter. No. Caitlin's voice rose. How dare you kick Mom out of the house, just over a tiny affair? Abraham's laugh was hollow. A tiny affair? With your teacher? The man who, as it turns out, is your biological father. The silence that followed was deafening. You're lying, Caitlin whispered. Abraham walked to his office, retrieved the DNA test results, and returned. He handed them to Caitlin with surgical precision. I'm a doctor, Caitlin. These numbers don't lie. Tears streamed down Caitlin's face as she read. This can't be true. Ask your mother. Rebecca's silence was answer enough. If you won't let her back in the house, Caitlin crumpled the papers. You're no longer my dad. I never was. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Go pack your things, both of you. I want you out tonight. Abe, please. Rebecca tried one last time. We can talk about this. There's nothing to talk about. You can contact my lawyer tomorrow. He turned away, his voice clinical, detached. You know what? Go and live with your mom on the streets. Get out from here. The sound of their footsteps on the stairs, of drawers being yanked open and clothes being stuffed into bags, of muffled sobs and angry whispers, filled the house. Abraham stood in the kitchen, surrounded by the half-chopped vegetables and shattered remnants of his life. Later that night, after they had gone, Abraham sat in his dark office at home. The house echoed with emptiness. On his desk, family photos seemed to mock him, vacation snapshots, graduation ceremonies, holiday portraits. 18 years of memories, all built on lies. His phone buzzed. A text from Lourdes. Do you need company? He stared at the message for a long moment before responding. Not tonight. Surgery at 7 a.m. tomorrow. Setting the phone down, Abraham looked at the DNA test results one last time before filing them away. Tomorrow, he would call Barry Hahn and start the divorce proceedings. Tomorrow, he would begin dismantling the life he thought he had. But tonight, in the darkness of his office, Dr. Abraham Wilkins allowed himself to feel the full weight of betrayal. The steady hands that had saved countless lives trembled as he poured himself a drink, and for the first time in decades, he wept. Barry Hahn's corner office overlooked the city courthouse, a view he'd earned through 20 years of prosecuting the worst kinds of betrayal. The former prosecutor studied the DNA test results and surveillance photos spread across his mahogany desk. They're not wasting any time, Barry said, sliding a legal notice across to Abraham. Marcy King filed the divorce petition this morning. She's demanding immediate spousal support and exclusive use of the house. Abraham's fingers tightened on his coffee cup. The house I bought before we were married? Marcy's aggressive, but she's not subtle. Barry leaned back, his chair creaking. She's built her career bleeding men like you dry. Successful professionals who can't afford public scandal. I won't be blackmailed. Good. Barry pulled out a thick folder. Because our forensic accountant found something interesting in your joint accounts, the numbers told a story more sordid than even Abraham had imagined. Regular transfers to an offshore account, carefully disguised as charitable donations. Credit card statements showing expensive gifts. Hotel charges in neighboring cities. How much? Abraham asked. Close to $500,000 over the past 3 years. Barry highlighted several transactions. Most of it coincides with Pete Wiggins's known gambling debts. A knock interrupted them. Barry's secretary entered with another stack of documents. The subpoenas for Westbrook Academy's records just came through. Perfect. Barry turned to Abraham. Ready to go on offense? What's our strategy? We hit them with everything. Financial fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, alienation of affection. And once we expose Pete's gambling debts, Rebecca's lawyer will have to shift from offense to damage control. Abraham stared out at the courthouse. And Caitlin? Barry's expression softened slightly. She's 17, almost legally an adult. The courts will consider her preference, but given the circumstances, I don't want her money, or her time. Abraham stood. I just want the truth on record. Across town, in Marcy King's significantly more modern office, Rebecca sat with perfect posture, her designer handbag clutched like a shield. He's not playing fair, Rebecca insisted. Using private investigators, DNA tests, it's harassment. Marcy, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s, typed rapidly on her laptop. It's legal discovery, and he's within his rights. What concerns me are these financial transfers. I was helping a friend in need. A friend who happened to be having an affair with you? Marcy's fingers stopped moving. A friend who's the biological father of your daughter? Rebecca's composure cracked slightly. You don't understand. No, you don't understand. Marcy closed her laptop. Your husband's lawyer was a prosecutor. He's building a criminal case, not just a divorce filing. Those transfers weren't just betrayal. They were fraud. But the prenup. The prenup becomes void if criminal activity is proven. Marcy's voice hardened. Tell me everything about Pete's gambling. Now. Headmaster Wilson Daly's office at Westbrook Academy radiated old-world privilege. Oak paneling, leather chairs, and generations of alumni photographs created an atmosphere of unshakable tradition. But today, that tradition was trembling. "This can't go public," Wilson insisted, his bow tie slightly askew. The reputation of... The reputation of the school? Wendy Bartlett's voice shook with anger. What about the reputation of every student whose mother Pete Wiggins targeted? Now, Ms. Bartlett, I have documentation going back 3 years. Wendy placed a USB drive on his desk. Security footage, email correspondence, complaints from other staff members that were lost in the system. Wilson's face reddened. Those files are school property, and I've already shared copies with Jamie Goldstein at the Herald. The name of the investigative reporter made Wilson collapse back into his chair. You didn't. She's running the story next week. Wendy stood. Unless you do the right thing. Fire Pete. Launch a formal investigation. Make this right. Before Wilson could respond, his phone buzzed. His secretary's voice trembled. Sir, there are police officers here with a warrant. And a news crew in the parking lot. Jamie Goldstein stood in front of the school's iconic brick facade, her red hair bright against the gathering storm clouds. Her cameraman adjusted the frame as she reviewed her notes. Westbrook Academy, the prestigious private school that has educated the city's elite for over a century, faces allegations of misconduct and cover-ups. Multiple sources within the school have provided evidence of inappropriate relationships between a teacher and students' mothers, along with financial irregularities involving hundreds of thousands of dollars. Parents gathered at the edges of the shot, phones recording, whispers spreading like wildfire. A police car pulled up, and 2 detectives emerged with boxes of seized documents. Inside, Pete Wiggins sat in the chemistry lab for the last time, watching through the window as his career imploded. His phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. They know about the money. All of it. His hands shook as he opened his desk drawer, pulling out a letter of resignation he'd prepared weeks ago. Too late now. The police would find the gambling debts, the loans, the threats from bookies. And Rebecca would tell them everything to save herself. The lab door opened. Detective Sarah Chin entered, her badge glinting. Mr. Wiggins? We need to talk about some financial transactions. In the library, Wendy Bartlett watched the scene unfold while copying more files. Other teachers began coming forward, the school counselor with notes from concerned students, the janitor with after-hours access logs, the business office staff with questioned expense reports. Ms. Bartlett? A junior reporter from the Herald approached. Can you tell us how long you've been documenting these incidents? Since the first red flag. Wendy looked at the growing crowd outside. Sometimes doing the right thing means burning everything down and starting over. The modest 2-bedroom apartment felt like a prison to Rebecca. No housekeeper, no garden service, no country club membership. Just beige walls and IKEA furniture. We can't live like this, she told Caitlin, who sat curled on the second-hand couch. Your father is destroying us. He's not my father. Caitlin's voice was bitter. You made sure of that. Don't take that tone with me. Rebecca paced the small living room. Everything I did was for us. And now he's trying to ruin everything. My reputation. My future. Your future. What about Pete? Caitlin's question hung in the air. Pete's. Rebecca's voice trailed off. Pete's dealing with his own problems. You mean his gambling debts? The ones you paid with Dad's, with Abraham's money? Rebecca spun to face her daughter. How did you? It's all over school. Caitlin stood, her face flushed. Everyone knows. Do you have any idea what it's like there now? My teacher, my biological father, was sleeping with students' mothers and stealing their money. It wasn't stealing. It was. Stop lying. Caitlin grabbed her phone. At least Abraham told me the truth, even when it hurt. Rebecca's expression hardened. Truth? You want truth? Fine. He's trying to destroy us, so we'll destroy him first. She pulled out a notebook. I've kept records of every patient he's lost, every complication in surgery. By the time I'm done, no one will trust him with a paper cut, let alone heart surgery. You're talking about ruining his career. Caitlin's voice shook. People could die if they're afraid to let him operate. He should have thought of that before he threw us out. Before he discovered your lies, you mean? Rebecca ignored her daughter's comment, already typing on her laptop. I've contacted every medical board in the state. Anonymous complaints about drinking before surgery, prescribing unnecessary medications, inappropriate behavior with nurses. None of that is true. It doesn't have to be true. Rebecca's smile was cold. It just has to be loud enough, constant enough, to create doubt. Unless. Unless what? Unless he agrees to reinstate us in his will. Give us what we deserve. At Metropolitan General, Abraham sat in Chief of Surgery Troy Calderon's office, surrounded by his colleagues. Dr. Lourdes Mansfield read through the latest batch of complaints. This is ridiculous, Lourdes said. Everyone knows you're the most careful surgeon on staff. You won't even take aspirin during call weeks. Troy Calderon, a commanding presence even seated, nodded. Our lawyers are already preparing responses. Every case Rebecca cited has complete documentation showing standard of care was not just met but exceeded, but the damage is already spreading. Abraham gestured to his significantly lighter surgery schedule. Patients are requesting other surgeons, not your regular patients. Lourdes set down the complaints, not the ones who know you. And the staff is behind you completely. Every nurse, every tech, every resident. They're all willing to sign statements supporting you. Salvatore Bernard, the hospital's lead counsel, entered with a stack of papers. We've got enough for a defamation suit. Multiple counts, provable damages, clear malicious intent. Do it, Abraham said quietly. No settlements, no deals. It'll be public, Troy warned. Messy. Everything's already public. Abraham stood. I've lost my wife, my daughter, and my home. I won't lose my integrity too. Later that night, Abraham sat in his office, reviewing surgical notes for the few cases that remained on his schedule. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It's Caitlin. Mom's lost it. She's going to destroy everything you've built unless you give her what she wants. I'm sorry. For everything. Abraham stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. Through his window, he could see the lights of the hospital chapel where he'd prayed the day Caitlin was born. The day he'd promised to always protect her, always love her. Some promises, he realized, were broken long before they were made. The next morning, Rebecca received a letter from Abraham's lawyers, not offering surrender or compromise, but serving notice of a defamation suit backed by the full power of Metropolitan General Hospital. As she read the detailed documentation dismantling each of her false complaints, her phone buzzed with news that would shatter what remained of her plans. Pete Wiggins had taken a deal with prosecutors. He would testify about everything, the affair, the money, the other mothers, in exchange for leniency. In his hospital office, Abraham prepared for his first surgery of the day, his hands steady as ever. Outside, life went on. Patients needed him. Residents needed teaching, and the truth, slowly but surely, was emerging from the wreckage of lies. Dr. Lourdes Mansfield watched him scrub in, noting the straight line of his shoulders, the calm focus in his eyes. Ready? Always. Abraham stepped into the OR, leaving the chaos of his personal life outside those sterile doors. Here, in this room, there was only the work, the healing, the truth of what his hands could do. And for now, that was enough. The courthouse's oak-paneled courtroom sat silent as Judge Eleanor Martinez reviewed the final pieces of evidence. Barry Hahn stood confidently at the plaintiff's table, while Rebecca shifted uncomfortably beside Marcy King, her designer outfit now months out of style. Your Honor, Barry's voice carried easily through the chamber, we'd like to present evidence of additional financial fraud perpetrated by Mrs. Wilkins and Mr. Wiggins. The projector hummed to life, displaying spreadsheets and bank statements on the courtroom screen. These documents show a pattern of systematic fraud targeting wealthy parents at Westbrook Academy, Barry continued. Mrs. Wilkins didn't just assist Mr. Wiggins with his gambling debts. They worked together to scam other families. Marcy King rose to object, but Rebecca grabbed her arm, shaking her head. Her face had gone pale. Judge Martinez leaned forward. Mrs. Wilkins, do you wish to respond to these allegations? Rebecca's voice trembled. No, Your Honor. Very well. The judge removed her reading glasses. Based on the overwhelming evidence presented, including proof of financial fraud, infidelity, and deliberate deception regarding paternity, I am granting Dr. Wilkins's petition for divorce. She paused, scanning the courtroom. Furthermore, given Mrs. Wilkins's criminal conduct, I am awarding Dr. Wilkins full ownership of all marital assets. The prenuptial agreement is void due to proven criminal activity. Rebecca slumped in her chair as Judge Martinez continued. Mrs. Wilkins, I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for criminal prosecution. Mr. Hahn has provided substantial evidence of wire fraud, theft by deception, and conspiracy. In the gallery, Detective Sarah Chan made notes while two uniformed officers moved closer to the courtroom doors. Your Honor, Marcy began. Your client perpetrated a years-long fraud that went far beyond a simple affair. Judge Martinez's voice hardened. She manipulated not only her husband but an entire school community. The court cannot ignore such calculated deception. As Rebecca was led away in handcuffs, Abraham sat quietly, his expression unreadable. Barry gathered his papers, speaking softly to his client. Pete Wiggins took a plea deal this morning, Barry said. He's testifying against Rebecca and the gambling syndicate he was involved with. They're looking at serious time. Abraham nodded. And Caitlin? She's 18 now. Legally an adult. Barry hesitated. She's been trying to contact your office. I know. Abraham stood, straightening his tie. Some bridges can't be rebuilt. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around Jamie Goldstein as she delivered her latest update. The divorce proceedings revealed a complex web of deception involving financial fraud at Westbrook Academy. Multiple families have come forward claiming they were targeted by Mr. Wiggins and Mrs. Wilkins. Sources say criminal indictments are pending. 6 months later, Abraham stood in Metropolitan General's teaching amphitheater, demonstrating a new valve replacement technique to a group of residents. His hands moved with practiced precision over the surgical simulator. The key is maintaining steady pressure while you secure the sutures, he explained. 1 millimeter's difference can mean the difference between success and failure. In the front row, Dr. Lourdes Mansfield watched with a slight smile. Besides her sat a woman she'd invited to observe, Dr. Letitia Roman, the hospital's new head of pediatric surgery. After the demonstration, Lourdes made the introduction. Abe, meet Dr. Roman. She's revolutionizing our pediatric cardiac program. Letitia's handshake was firm, her dark eyes direct. That was an impressive demonstration, Dr. Wilkins. Though I prefer working with smaller vessels in my tiny patients. Please call me Abraham. He noticed the plain gold band on her right hand, a widow's ring. I'd love to hear about your techniques. Maybe over coffee. Later, in the hospital cafeteria, their conversation flowed naturally from surgical procedures to personal histories. Military service took Jason from me 3 years ago, Letitia said, stirring her coffee. Left me with 2 boys and a lot of questions about what family really means. Abraham nodded. I thought I knew what family meant. 18 years of marriage taught me otherwise. I heard about the scandal. Letitia's voice was gentle but direct. Must have been hard, having your personal life splashed across the headlines. The betrayal was worse than the publicity. Abraham studied his cup. Finding out my daughter, that Caitlin wasn't mine. That everything I'd built was based on lies. Biology isn't everything. Letitia set down her cup. My boys are adopted. Jason and I couldn't have children, but they're ours in every way that matters. Their conversation continued through afternoon rounds, where Abraham watched Letitia with her young patients. Her compassion was evident, but so was her strength. She didn't sugarcoat difficult news, but she delivered it with genuine empathy. You're good with them, he commented as they left the pediatric ward. Children deserve honesty, she replied, even when it's hard. Maybe especially then. Over the following months, their professional collaboration grew into friendship. They consulted on complex cases, combining their expertise to save lives that might have been lost to either of them working alone. Dr. Mansfield watched their growing connection with satisfaction. During a particularly challenging surgery they performed together, she observed their seamless teamwork from the gallery. They move like they can read each other's minds, a resident whispered. Lourdes smiled. That's what happens when trust and respect come before everything else. 3 years passed. Abraham stood at the window of his new office at Metropolitan General, now decorated with photos of himself and Letitia at medical conferences, their blended family at graduation ceremonies, and most recently, their wedding day. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Troy Calderon entered, holding a letter. Westbrook Academy's new board wants you as a trustee, Troy said. They're implementing ethical oversight guidelines, want your input given. Everything that happened, Abraham took the letter. Interesting timing. Pete Wiggins gets out next month. And Rebecca? 2 more years, with restitution payments. Abraham set the letter down. Caitlin sent another letter last week. Wanting to meet. Troy raised an eyebrow. And some chapters need to stay closed. Abraham's phone buzzed. A text from Letitia about their foundation's latest pediatric case. Others are just beginning. Later that evening, Abraham and Letitia sat in their home office, reviewing applications for their children's medical foundation. Photos of her sons, now his stepsons, playing baseball decorated the walls alongside their medical degrees. Connor got accepted to medical school. Letitia mentioned, sorting through papers. He wants to be a cardiac surgeon, like his stepdad. Abraham smiled. As long as he knows it's his choice. No expectations, unlike some people we know. Her tone was gentle. I got a letter from Westbrook Academy today, he said. They want help preventing future scandals. Are you going to accept? Abraham considered the question. Maybe it's time. Use what happened to protect others. You're not the same man who lost everything 3 years ago, Letitia observed. You're stronger. We're stronger, he corrected. This foundation, our family, our work, it's all built on truth this time. The next morning, Abraham sat down to write his response to Westbrook Academy. Through his office window, he could see the hospital chapel where he'd once prayed over a daughter he thought was his. Now he said a different kind of prayer, one of gratitude for second chances and real love. As he finished the letter accepting the trustee position, his office phone rang. Another emergency case, another life to save. He grabbed his coat, heading for or where Letitia would already be scrubbing in. They worked seamlessly together now, their personal and professional lives intertwined in ways he'd never imagined possible during those dark days 3 years ago. In the surgical lounge after the successful operation, Abraham found a letter in his locker, the latest from Caitlin. Unlike the others, this one would remain unopened. Some betrayals broke you, but others broke you free. He'd finally learned the difference. That evening, at home with Letitia and their sons, Abraham watched his new family share stories around the dinner table. Connor talked excitedly about medical school plans while his younger brother debated the merits of different residency programs. You're smiling, Letitia observed quietly. Just thinking about how loss can lead to finding something real, he replied. Something true. Later, as they prepared for bed, Letitia asked, any regrets? About Caitlin? Abraham considered the question carefully. I regret that she lost her way. That Rebecca's lies cost her a father. But I can't regret moving forward. Sometimes healing means accepting that not every broken thing can be fixed. But some broken things come back stronger, Letitia added, squeezing his hand. Abraham nodded, thinking of their foundation's work, their blended family, their shared mission of healing. Everything they'd built together was based on choice, on truth, on mutual respect, not obligation or deception. Some betrayals break you, he said, echoing words he'd repeat many times in the years to come. And others break you free. The key is knowing the difference. Epilogue. 10 years later. The autumn wind scattered leaves across the grounds of Metropolitan General Hospital's new pediatric wing. The brass plaque beside the entrance read, the Wilkins Roman Foundation Center for Children's Cardiac Care. Inside, Dr. Abraham Wilkins, now 58, stood before a gathered crowd at the center's 10th anniversary celebration. A decade ago, he began, his silver hair catching the light. This foundation was born from a belief that every broken heart deserves a chance to heal, whether it's physical or emotional. In the front row, Dr. Letitia Roman Wilkins squeezed her husband's hand. Their years together had only deepened the connection that began in those dark days after his divorce. Her sons, now accomplished doctors themselves, sat beside her, Connor having followed Abraham into cardiothoracic surgery, while Marcus had chosen pediatric oncology. Through this center, Abraham continued, we've treated over 10,000 children who couldn't afford specialized cardiac care. But today, I want to share a different kind of story about healing. The room fell silent as Abraham pulled out a worn envelope. 3 months ago, I received this letter from the Rockland Women's Correctional Facility. It was from my ex-wife, Rebecca. A murmur rippled through the audience. Even after a decade, the scandal remained part of the hospital's lore. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning. Dear Abraham, I'm writing this from my prison cell, where I've spent the last 7 years contemplating the magnitude of my betrayal. The doctors say my cancer is terminal, 3 months, maybe 4. Before I go, I need you to know the truth about everything. The money we stole from Westbrook parents didn't just go to Pete's gambling debts. We were running a sophisticated investment scam, targeting wealthy families through their children's education. Pete would identify vulnerable mothers during parent-teacher conferences, and I would befriend them at school functions. We destroyed lives, Abraham, not just yours. Pete committed suicide in his cell last year. He couldn't live with what we'd done, but I need to live long enough to make amends. I've provided the FBI with details about every scam, every victim. Some of the money might be recoverable. Caitlin visits me sometimes. She's a different person now, harder, more cynical. The trust fund you set up for her education remains untouched. She says she doesn't deserve it. Your kindness in providing for her education, despite everything, shames me more than my prison sentence. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I needed you to know that losing you, losing the life we had, wasn't worth any amount of money or excitement. The woman I was then seems like a stranger now. The nurses here know about your foundation. They say you and Letitia are doing amazing work. I'm glad you found happiness. It proves what I learned too late, that love built on truth lasts, while lies poison everything they touch. I'm sorry, Abraham, for everything. Rebecca. Back in the present, Abraham folded the letter carefully. Rebecca passed away last month. In her final act, she helped recover millions in stolen funds, which her victims' families are finally receiving. In the audience, Wendy Bartlett, now Westbrook Academy superintendent, dabbed at her eyes. The scandal had eventually led to her promotion and the school's complete reformation. Under her leadership, Westbrook had become a model of ethical education. But this story isn't about revenge or justice, Abraham continued. It's about the choices we make after betrayal. Do we let it break us, or do we let it break us free? Dr. Lourdes Mansfield, retired but still sharp as ever, smiled knowingly. She had watched Abraham rebuild his life, had introduced him to Letitia, had seen their love grow from shared pain into something beautiful. Through this foundation, we've chosen to transform pain into purpose. Every child we save, every family we help, is a testament to the power of starting over. The screen behind him displayed photos of their work. Children before and after surgery, families reunited, lives transformed. Among them was a recent picture that caught everyone's attention. A young woman in a white coat, her features hauntingly familiar. My daughter Caitlin, Abraham's voice softened, graduated from medical school last month. She's beginning her residency in psychiatry, specializing in helping children cope with family trauma. We're rebuilding, slowly. On honest ground this time, the revelation caused another stir. It was the first time he had publicly acknowledged renewed contact with his former daughter. She works at a clinic across town, he continued. Different hospital, different specialty. We see each other at medical conferences sometimes. Small steps, but real ones. Letitia stood, joining her husband at the podium. Life isn't about the families we're born into or the lies we're told, she added. It's about the truths we choose to live by. The ceremony continued, but the story wasn't finished. Later that evening, in their home office, Abraham and Letitia reviewed files of new cases while their grandchildren played in the next room. Connor's twins and Marcus's daughter filled the house with the kind of honest laughter that only children could provide. Did you tell them about the other letter? Letitia asked softly. Abraham nodded, pulling out another envelope. This one was from Pete Wiggins, written days before his death. Dr. Wilkins, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. The guilt finally won. Prison gives you too much time to think about your sins. I want you to know that Caitlin was the only good thing that came from all our deceptions. She may be my biological daughter, but you were her real father in every way that mattered. The way you provided for her education, even after everything we did. It showed me what true fatherhood means. The money is hidden in offshore accounts. Rebecca knows the details. Make sure it gets back to the families we hurt. I'm sorry. Not that it matters now. A knock at the door interrupted them. Caitlin stood in the doorway, still in her hospital scrubs. At 27, she carried herself with a guarded professionalism that spoke of hard lessons learned young. The children's group therapy program you sponsored, she said, it's helping. One of my patients finally opened up today about her parents' divorce. Abraham nodded, careful to maintain the professional distance they'd established. That's good to hear. I have some ideas for expanding the program, she continued. If you and Letitia have time to discuss it, maybe over dinner next week? The invitation hung in the air. Another small step toward healing. We'd like that, Letitia answered warmly. After Caitlin left, Abraham stood at his office window, watching her walk to her car. The security lights caught the silver threads in his hair, reflecting in the glass. You never told me what was in Rebecca's final letter, Letitia said quietly. Abraham touched the pocket where it rested. She wrote it to Caitlin, actually. Asked me to deliver it when I thought the time was right. And is it? He thought about their cautious reconciliation, the careful steps toward rebuilding trust. Soon, maybe, when she's ready to hear that her mother finally understood the difference between love and possession. In the next room, their grandchildren's laughter mixed with the sound of Connor teaching his twins about heart valves using a toy medical kit. The future of their foundation, their family's legacy of healing, played out in miniature. You know what I learned? Abraham said, turning to his wife. Some betrayals do break you. They shatter everything you thought you knew about love and trust and family. But if you're lucky, if you're blessed, they break you free to build something stronger. Something real. Letitia took his hand, her wedding ring catching the light. And the key is knowing the difference? No, he smiled, watching their blended, beautiful family through the door. The key is being brave enough to try again. To believe that truth, even painful truth, is better than comfortable lies. In his desk drawer, one last unopened letter waited. Rebecca's final words to the daughter whose life had been built on lies. Someday, when the foundations of their rebuilt relationship were stronger, Abraham would share it with Caitlin. But for now, they would continue their careful dance of reconciliation, building trust one honest moment at a time. After all, they had learned the hardest way possible that real family isn't about biology or obligation. It's about choice, about forgiveness, about the courage to face truth and the wisdom to know that sometimes the deepest wounds can lead to the most profound healing. Outside, the autumn wind continued to scatter leaves across the hospital grounds, nature's reminder that endings are just beginnings in disguise. Inside the Wilkins Roman home, surrounded by the family they had chosen and the love they had built, Abraham and Letitia held onto their hard-won truth, that betrayal's greatest gift is the freedom to discover what loyalty really means. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.
I grew up in a small Midwest town, surrounded by endless fields and a close-knit community. My childhood was a mix of ordinary days and extraordinary dreams. My parents, though not wealthy, instilled in me a sense of ambition and discipline. My dad was a veteran who shared stories of resilience, and my mom was a nurturing force who held our family together. High school was where I began shaping my identity. I excelled in math and science, dreaming of becoming an engineer. My best friend Jace and I spent countless hours sketching out imaginary machines and planning our futures. He was the bold one, always pushing boundaries, while I preferred the safety of clear rules and steady goals. After graduation, life took us in unexpected directions. Jace joined the military while I pursued engineering in college, but financial challenges and youthful mistakes led me to a crossroads, and I found myself enlisting as well. The Army became a crucible, forging me into someone stronger but also more guarded. By the time I returned home, I was a changed man. The innocence of my youth had been replaced by the weight of experience. I channeled my energy into education, eventually securing a job at GM where I met Sally. She was a light in my life, someone who brought color to the grayness that had settled over me. Together we built a life, a family, and a home, something I thought was unshakable. Awareness seeped back into me gradually, as though I were emerging from a thick fog. The dim glow of the basement workshop, filtering through the gap in the door, seemed to mirror my mood. Beyond the wooden divider, a racket sat firmly clamped in its vise, a remnant of my earlier work session. I could hear our youngest two kids playing and the Disney movie they were watching in the rec room. Sitting in my old chair, I glanced at the clock. I'd been there for over half an hour, lost in thought, trying to block out whatever I didn't want to hear. Dinner was done. Sally cleaned up while I headed to the basement to reglue some rackets for the fall racquetball leagues. I'd been playing for years, usually in the A bracket, and I took pride in my skills and fitness. At 6'2" and about 200 pounds, I kept in good shape despite the demands of my engineering job at GM. Our 7-year-old daughter, Jessie, followed me down to watch a movie with her younger sister, Allie. At this age, Allie always tagged along with Jessie. I couldn't help but wonder how things would change as Jessie grew up. Our 9-year-old son, Jason, was the oldest and usually retreated to his room to build model airplanes. I finished the handles on my 3 rackets and pulled the strings tighter, preparing for a potential mid-game break. Checking on the girls, I saw they were absorbed in Lady and the Tramp, so I decided to head upstairs. As I climbed the stairs, I overheard Sally talking on the phone. I briefly considered surprising her, setting the mood for later, even though we'd already shared some time together that morning. But when I peeked through the door, I heard Sally giggling. I froze. That laugh was different. Familiar, but unsettling. Then I heard her whisper, "Sure would like to try that thing again before the wart comes off." That strange comment triggered a memory from a conversation I'd had in a bar a couple of months ago. I suddenly felt dizzy and collapsed on the basement stairs, shutting the door behind me. Sally continued laughing, her voice dropping lower. I could catch only a few words. "Last time I was really on a roll. I can't wait." I didn't want her to know I was there, so I quietly retreated to my workshop, reflecting on the conversation. It reminded me of a night after a racquetball match when I had been at the bar with John and Craig. After discussing the game, the conversation shifted to women. I noticed that John and Craig seemed unusually interested in my marriage. Though they weren't trying to flirt, their probing questions made me uncomfortable, and I'd left early a few times to avoid the topic. That night, Craig was teasing John about his wife Mary, insisting he get a personal surgery. I assumed it was a vasectomy and mentioned that Sally had talked about having me get one, but we hadn't agreed yet. Craig kept smirking while John looked distressed. "Oh no, she wants him to remove the wart," Craig said, laughing. I was confused. "What's going on?" I asked. John blushed and explained he had a wart in a private spot. He'd seen it grow over the years, and now Mary wanted it removed. John wasn't so much concerned about the money as he was about losing his advantage in attracting other women, as the wart seemed to be a topic of interest. Realizing I wasn't comfortable with their conversation, I decided to leave. Now, sitting in the dark, I couldn't believe Sally could be involved in something like what her phone call suggested. Sally knew John and Craig from racquetball, but I didn't think they'd ever met her. The pieces started connecting, and I couldn't ignore the possibility that something was going on. Sweating, I hoped there was a logical explanation, but Debbie, Sally's boss, was clearly involved. Debbie had been with the company for 5 years and had become a close friend to Sally. They'd bonded when both were pregnant, and over time their families socialized a few times, though we were never close. John and Craig had joined the Wise Racquetball League a couple of years ago. Despite similar family situations, we only socialized at games or afterward over beers, never with our families. It wasn't until recently, when I mentioned the store where Sally worked, that I learned Debbie was an acquaintance of John and Craig. They had attended the same high school, and John mentioned they saw each other a couple of times a year. About 2 years ago, when Allie was in the midst of the terrible twos, Sally had been struggling. Jessie went to daycare, and I was working extra hours. One night, Sally broke down from exhaustion, and after comforting her, I offered to take full responsibility for the kids on her next day off so she could get a break. She thanked me and said she'd think about it. A couple of weeks later, Sally said she'd talk to Debbie about needing a break. Debbie suggested a shopping trip to upscale malls in Detroit. Though I had reservations, I agreed. Sally and Debbie left on a Saturday morning, checked into a motel, had dinner, and saw a movie. I insisted on getting the hotel info, which she provided. The next day, they checked out, went to another mall, and returned home by 5 p.m. Sally was grateful for the trip and hugged me when she got home, sharing all the details. She hadn't gone overboard shopping, but bought a few nice things for herself and the kids. I was glad she had a good time, and the kids were well behaved, so I had no complaints. Over 2 years ago, after Sally's first shopping trip with Debbie, it became a regular thing. Every few months, they'd leave Saturday morning and return late Sunday. I didn't mind much. I enjoyed time with the kids, and Sally seemed happy. I couldn't recall any major changes at first, but after the second trip, Sally returned in a different mood, sullen and a bit nervous. When I asked, she said it was nothing, just that her period had started. I recalled that since then, we hadn't been intimate on the nights she returned, but we always were a few days before she left. I hadn't thought much about it until now. Sally called me from the top of the stairs. "Phil, it's bath time for the girls. Can you send them up?" I sighed and went upstairs to gather them. I tried to stay calm, but emotions were building inside. When I returned, Sally was in the kitchen, flipping through a cookbook. She smiled, looked me in the eye, and asked, "Is something wrong, honey?" I mumbled about a cracked racket, but kept studying her, looking for signs. She seemed normal, just Sally, my wife. She kissed me and mentioned Debbie had called to plan another shopping trip. When she said it, her eyes narrowed and she quickly looked away. I knew something was off, and I wondered how long this had been going on. I tried to change the subject. "Do we have anything planned for next weekend?" I asked. She said there was nothing on the calendar. I suggested a VFW event on Saturday, but she wasn't interested. "I don't care if your dad goes," she said. "I'm not going. It bores me to tears." I pushed, suggesting a family trip to Cedar Point, but Sally got defensive. "We just took the kids to Mackinac Island. What's gotten into you, Phil? You've never minded me shopping before." I grew frustrated and said, "Never mind. I just thought we could do something together." She walked away, saying, "You and Debbie are having fun. I'll go check on the kids." That night, I pretended to sleep, but I couldn't stop thinking. I heard Sally come to bed and whisper my name, but I stayed still. Eventually, she rolled away and I lay awake, reflecting on everything. I thought about my childhood, growing up just a few miles from where we live now. I had a normal, middle-class family, my parents and older sister. My best friend Jace lived a block away. We were inseparable. He was the outgoing, life-of-the-party type, and I was quieter, more thoughtful. We spent our youth playing sports, chasing girls, and in the end, both lost our virginity before prom. In high school, I started taking drafting classes and decided to become an engineer. Jace wasn't sure what he wanted, but we both enrolled in community college. After my first year, I had a big mistake. I got arrested for drunk driving after a party and spent the night in jail. My parents bailed me out and they were furious. After everything, I spent all my savings on fines, court fees, and lost my driver's license for a year. For the rest of the semester, I rode my moped, giving Jace rides. Eventually, I gave up on school. It felt pointless without a license or money. The next year, I enlisted in the Army, hoping my drafting skills would land me an engineering job and keep me out of Vietnam. The recruiter lied, of course. Jace decided to join me, and we enlisted as buddies, guaranteed to train together. Basic training was tough but manageable. During aptitude tests, the Army decided we'd make good fire control specialists, which meant operating a high-tech calculator to help artillery hit targets. Afterward, we were sent to Fort Sill for more training. It wasn't great, but Jace and I had fun. A few weeks before graduation, we received orders for Vietnam. After a short break at home, we flew to I Corps in Vietnam, where we were assigned to Battery A, 2nd Battalion, 11th Artillery. It was November 1969, and Nixon was reducing troop numbers. For the first few months, there wasn't much combat, just a lot of flying and some occasional raids. The highlight of our tour was a wild vacation in Bangkok. Then, our unit was sent to a remote hill in the jungle, and things took a dark turn. 4 months later, I came home on a stretcher, and Jace was dead. I was mentally and physically broken. I spent weeks in the hospital and months in rehab. After being declared almost fit for duty, I returned to Fort Sill as an assistant instructor. I enrolled in college courses to keep busy, avoiding social interactions. After a year, I applied for early release from the Army and was accepted into an engineering program at a local university. I moved back in with my parents and lived on savings, education benefits, and a part-time job. I was a classic shell-shocked Vietnam vet, bitter, withdrawn, and struggling with my experiences. I grew a beard, wore old clothes, and kept to myself. I saw a therapist occasionally, but didn't feel it helped much. I visited Jace's parents regularly to talk about him. It was the least I could do. One day, while studying in the campus center, a woman approached and asked if she could sit with me. She had striking red hair and a pale complexion. I was immediately struck by her, but when she asked if I was a Vietnam vet, I flinched. I said yes, but left it at that. She mentioned her dad was a Korean War vet, and I relaxed a bit. We talked for a while until she had to leave for class. A couple of days later, she returned and asked if she could sit with me again. This time I was more composed, and we chatted like old friends. Eventually, she realized she didn't know my name, so I introduced myself. "Phil Robinson," I said. "Sally Baxter," she replied, laughing. And just like that, I met Sally. It turned out that Sally and I had long breaks between classes on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. Over the next few weeks, we spent most of those breaks together. She shared almost everything about her life, family, friends, career plans, and I was fascinated by her outgoing social personality. She reminded me a lot of Jace. I told her about my family and classes, but avoided talking about the Army. I preferred to listen to her. Her voice could have read me the phone book, and I'd still be interested. Slowly, I started taking better care of myself, shaving, getting a haircut, and dressing better. My mom noticed and teased me, but she was clearly happy for me. A few weeks in, I finally asked her out. She agreed right away, but warned, "My dad can be tough on guys who ask me out." I told her, "If dating you means dealing with your dad, it's worth it." She blushed and called me a flatterer. That Friday, I knocked on her door and was greeted by her mother, Emily, who welcomed me warmly. Before I could say anything, she called, "Jack, Sally's beau is here." Emily introduced herself and we shook hands. Soon, Sally's father, Jack, appeared. He was big, about my height, but much heavier, and his presence was imposing. He shook my hand firmly and invited me into the family room. As we sat, I noticed military memorabilia, including a Marine Corps flag and an M1 Garand rifle displayed proudly above the fireplace. Jack, a Korean War veteran, mentioned his service and injuries, and I briefly shared that I was a Vietnam vet. We talked about military history, and Jack seemed skeptical, even dismissive of my role. He muttered about Vietnamization and the end of the war, but Emily tried to steer the conversation away from politics. Sally entered, and we quickly shifted topics to school. After a while, we said our goodbyes, and I took Sally out to dinner and a movie. The evening was mostly a blur, as I was so focused on her. We held hands, sitting so close that our heads almost touched. Afterward, we stopped by a bar for a drink, and I walked her to the door. I hesitated, unsure whether to kiss her, but she reached up, wrapped her arms around my neck, and whispered, "Thank you for a wonderful evening." Time seemed to stop as I looked into her eyes, realizing I had fallen in love with her. I kissed her gently, and from that moment on, we shared intimate moments like that, holding each other close, unable to hide our feelings. The next day, I called Sally, and we talked for an hour. We quickly made plans for another date, and just like that, we became exclusive. A few weeks later, when I mentioned booking a motel room for the weekend, she blushed, but smiled and nodded. The evening was everything I hoped for, though there were a few awkward moments when she noticed the scars from Vietnam. I reassured her that I was fine. I whispered, "Sally, I love you. I can't help it." She pulled back, tears in her eyes, and smiled. "I love you too, Phil. I never knew it could be like this." Relieved, I kissed her nose and said, "I want to do this again and again." That night was perfect. For the first time since losing Jace, I felt at peace. We talked about our future, marriage, kids, where to live. Sally was graduating soon, and I would follow a year later. We decided she'd work after graduation, and we'd marry when I finished school. In the meantime, I rented an apartment so we could be together. A week later, I introduced Sally to my parents. They hit it off right away, and my mom later told me she loved Sally for how she brought me out of my shell. I was happy again, smiling constantly, even to the point that my therapist kicked me out, telling me I didn't need his help anymore. Sally's father, Jack, and I had a tense relationship. He was protective, especially when we discussed living together before marriage. But things changed when Jack invited me over for a private conversation. After some small talk, Jack mentioned Sally had told him about my scars. I felt uncomfortable, but Jack understood. We briefly discussed my time in Vietnam, and I told him I had been at Ripcord in the summer of '70. To my surprise, Jack knew about it. After that, he treated me like family. Things moved quickly after that. Sally graduated with honors, got a job, and spent more time with me. Her parents, however, thought she should move in with me permanently. I graduated on time, got a job at General Motors, and 2 months later, we got married. We bought a small house, and a year later, our son Jason was born. 2 years after that, we had Jesse, and then Allison 3 years later. The birth of our kids changed everything. Sally worked part-time after Jason was born and planned to return full-time once the kids were older. Meanwhile, my work evolved as I transitioned into automated manufacturing. By the time Allison was born, I was part of a team learning about the first computer-aided design systems. Life was good. We had plenty of money, 2 cars, and a nice home. Over the years, we expanded with a new bedroom, bathroom, and rec room. We had 3 healthy, beautiful kids and took family vacations every year. Twice a year, Sally and I sent the kids to their grandparents for a long weekend. I always thought our marriage was strong. We loved each other openly, holding hands, hugging, and sharing affection. I often told Sally how lucky I was. But recently, I wasn't so sure anymore. Sleep became elusive, and I spent most nights staring at the wall, barely getting any rest. I skipped my usual morning workout and instead sat at my desk, trying to figure out what was going wrong. I couldn't ask Sally directly. If she was hiding something, she might not tell me the truth. I wasn't even sure what the truth was, but I had a sinking feeling that something was off. I loved Sally and the kids. The thought of losing them terrified me, but the idea that Sally might not love me anymore was even scarier. For days, I felt like a zombie, distracted and disconnected from everything. It wasn't until Jace mentioned my behavior that Sally noticed. I brushed it off as work stress. On Tuesday, I returned to my routine and played racquetball. John and Craig were there, as usual. I'd never seen one without the other, and something about their closeness started to unsettle me. They acted like they shared some secret, and when they smirked at me, I began to see them as rivals. We played a few casual games, but my mind was elsewhere. By Wednesday, I decided to check on their whereabouts. I called John's house, and his wife said he was going to a business conference in Detroit. When I called Craig's house, I got the same answer. My heart sank. I didn't need proof. This was it. I knew they'd met up together. But how far had it gone? I was furious. A voice inside me said, "Do something." That Friday, I stopped by my parents' house. They were renovating in preparation for a potential move to Florida, but I needed their support. After some small talk, I finally blurted out, "I think Sally is cheating on me." The words broke something inside me, and I cried for the first time. My parents were shocked. Mom whispered, "No, not Sally. She wouldn't do that to you." Dad asked, "Why do you think that?" I told them everything. What I had overheard, what I'd learned. Mom cried quietly, and Dad comforted her, asking, "What do you need from us?" "I need to know for sure. Can you take the kids tomorrow and keep them until Sunday? I have to be where they'll be tomorrow night." Dad hesitated, then agreed. "Sure, Phil, but I pray this is all a misunderstanding." "Yeah, me too," I said, though I wasn't sure how it could be. I left feeling hollow, uncertain of what came next. When I got home, Sally was cheerfully finishing dinner. She greeted me with a hug and a kiss, saying, "The kids are in the break room. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. She seemed preoccupied, practically buzzing with energy. It struck me that we hadn't been intimate since the previous Saturday, and we'd missed our usual midweek meeting. I'd been in a bad mood all week, taking sleeping pills to get through the nights, and Sally never mentioned it. I hesitated, then suggested, "How about we put the kids to bed early and have some time for ourselves tonight?" Sally stepped back, and her smile faltered. "I got my period early today," she said, clearly uncomfortable. I forced a smile. "Okay, I understand." She gently stroked my cheek and promised, "As soon as my period is over, I'll explain everything." I nodded, muttering, "Then it's a date." She hugged me and returned to cooking. I slowly headed upstairs, anger brewing inside me. I now knew she was saving herself for tomorrow's date. The voice in my head grew louder. Do something. At dinner, I struggled to hide my emotions. The kids chattered away, unaware. Could this be the last time we had dinner together as a family? The thought brought tears to my eyes. The next day, we followed our usual Saturday routine. The kids cleaned their rooms, then watched cartoons. I spent time in the garage until Sally was ready to leave. She came downstairs with her suitcase, reminding the kids to behave while she was gone. Allie clung to her, demanding she buy her something. Sally promised, kissed Allie goodbye, and left for the hotel. I watched her drive off, holding Allie in my arms. Once she was out of sight, I turned to the kids and told them we were going to Grandma and Grandpa's house for the night. They packed quickly and we headed out. At my parents' house, Dad gave me a concerned look. "Good luck, Phil. I hope you're wrong." "I hope so too," I replied. "Thanks for helping. I'll call you in the morning." I left, switching cars at Avis to avoid recognition. Back home, I sat in the kitchen, replaying the week's events. The phone finally rang around 1 a.m. It was Sally. "Is that you, Phil?" "Yeah, it's me. Is everything okay?" I asked with a touch of sarcasm. "We're fine. We stopped for lunch. We're in room 168, 555-645-0168, she replied before rushing off. "Debbie's waving at me. We're spending the afternoon at Meadowbrook Shopping Center. I'll see you tomorrow." The phone clicked off without her saying, "I love you." That morning, she hadn't said it either. I dialed the Red Roof Inn, confirming Sally had checked in. I decided I wouldn't call her room. I'd see her later. I hung up, then dialed again. I called the Red Roof Inn again, asking if John Harrison was registered. They confirmed he was, but hadn't checked in yet. I said I'd call back later and hung up, trying to control the rising anger that felt like it could explode at any moment. I went into the workshop, unlocked the tool cabinet, and stood staring at my dad's old rifle. I thought about taking one with me, but the idea of never seeing my kids again stopped me. Instead, I grabbed a beat-up shoebox from the drawer and pulled out a sea knife I'd bought in Bangkok. I strapped it to my calf, then gathered a few things: driving gloves, water, candy bars, and headed out at 2 p.m. for the 90-mile drive to Rochester Hills. I parked near the Red Roof Inn by room 168, but didn't see Sally's car. I waited, thinking about her and the kids. Around 5, I saw John and Craig arrive in a red pickup, laughing and unloading bags. They went into a nearby room, and after about 45 minutes, they left. I followed them to Tupper's Pub, where I parked on the street and waited. Soon, I spotted Sally's car and parked so I could see both it and the truck. I debated going inside, but stayed in the car, listening to country songs that matched my mood. At 9 p.m., the 4 of them finally left, laughing and holding hands. I decided to beat them back to the hotel. I parked, and 10 minutes later, they pulled in. I watched them outside, talking and laughing under the light by room 1. John tossed a coin, and Craig kissed Sally. Debbie grabbed John's hand, and they all went into different rooms, still laughing. My mind raced. Was this some kind of game? The pain hit hard, and the voice in my head screamed, "Do something." I couldn't undo what had happened. 10 years of marriage, a family, all ruined. What good would confronting them do now? At least I'd know the truth. Then John came out of Debbie's room holding a beer, dressed in boxer shorts. He walked over to Sally's room and knocked. A few minutes later, Craig came out of Debbie's room, no shirt or shoes. They talked briefly before high-fiving each other. John went into Sally's room and Craig went back to Debbie's. Suddenly, it hit me. I'd completely lost control. A voice screamed in my head, "Do something now!" I felt a surge of madness. Unable to stop, I put on my driving gloves, got out of the car, and walked straight to room 168. I covered the peephole with my thumb and knocked twice. As the door began to open and John said, "What the hell, Craig?" I threw a punch, kicking him with all my anger. John stumbled back and fell to the floor, hands over his face. I noticed the disarray in the room, the overturned bed, the bathroom door slightly ajar, and the shower running. I unsheathed my knife and tapped it against John's nose. His eyes widened in fear. "How long, John? How long has this been going on?" "Don't lie to me," I said coldly. 2 years, he stammered, eyes wide. "Joining the same racquetball league wasn't a coincidence?" "No," he whispered, closing his eyes in pain. I leaned in. "You're sick, John. Look at me." I paused. "If you ever go near Sally or any other married woman again, I'll find you and make sure you regret it. Understand?" "Yes," he wheezed, terrified. Suddenly, I smelled something foul. The shower stopped, and I heard Sally's voice. "Hey, John boy, I thought you were joining me in the shower." I turned, just as Sally appeared in the bathroom doorway, towel in hand, her face draining of color as she saw me. Shock overtook her as the towel fell to the floor. "John boy doesn't seem well," I growled, stepping toward her. Panic flashed in her eyes as she slammed the bathroom door shut. I walked over to the nightstand, cut the phone cord with my knife, and sheathed the blade. Then I stormed out, but not before throwing the phone violently into the bathroom door, causing a loud crash and a terrified scream from inside. I stepped outside, took a deep breath, and realized I wasn't done yet. I headed to the next room. I knocked on the door of Craig's room. When it opened, I punched him under the chin. He went down, and Debbie, wide-eyed and in a panic, sat in bed. I checked Craig's pulse. He was fading. I went to the nightstand, pulled the phone cord, and turned to Debbie. If you tell your husband about tonight, tell him I said hi, I said sarcastically, then added, or maybe I'll tell him myself. I tossed the phone into the corner and left. Outside, I looked up at the sky and took a deep breath, the tension gradually fading. The voice in my head was silent now. Everything was done. It was time to move on with my life. As I made my way to the car, my phone rang. Annoyed, I answered. Yeah? Phil, it's Jack, came the voice on the other end. What's going on? I asked, my tone uninterested. Sally's at the house crying. She says she's afraid to go home. I glanced at the clock, almost 1 p.m., nearly 14 hours since I'd left Rochester Hills. I don't know what I could have done, I muttered, feeling confused. She says you hurt Debbie's friends badly last night. Hurt them? They're lucky I didn't eliminate them, I shot back sarcastically. What the hell? That's not like you, Jack responded, clearly shocked. I paused for a moment, then asked, Did Sally tell you where the fight happened? She mentioned it was outside a restaurant in Rochester Hills. So she's trying to avoid it? Jack replied, his tone sharp. Well, with her family and history. I trailed off. Sally's your daughter, so I guess it must be true, I said slowly, sensing Jack was processing everything. Phil, I'm bringing Sally home. We need to talk, Jack said. No problem, I replied. I'm not going anywhere. Jack hung up, but I heard Sally in the background. No, Dad, no. I sighed. She's not making this easy, I thought. I was sitting at the kitchen table drinking my second beer and looking through old photos when Jack and Sally arrived. Sally clung to Jack's arm, pulling him toward the door. Please, Dad, let us talk. Phil and I need some time alone. Sally was makeup-free, her hair loose, eyes red and swollen, shaking like a nervous wreck. She wouldn't look at me, trying to guide Jack back toward the door, but he sat down at the table, his eyes darting between me and the KA knife beside my beer. Okay, Phil, what's going on? Jack asked, his voice tight. I looked at Sally and mockingly said, Yes, Sally, tell your dad what's going on. She snapped, Shut up, Phil, you and I can work this out. Her commanding voice didn't match the pleading in her eyes. I was furious. The idea that she thought we could fix this alone, or that she could manipulate me, pushed me further. I was determined to be as honest as she was dishonest. I turned to Jack. Sally and her boss Debbie have a couple of girlfriends they go out with when they're out of town. I found out, and didn't take it well. I paused, then added, I might have been a little more polite than she deserved. Sally sighed, sitting down, her face dropping. Jack looked at me in disbelief. No, Phil, Sally wouldn't do that. I don't believe you. Enough, Phil, Jack snapped, his anger rising. You're being cruel. I stared at him, then shot back. Cruel? You would have seen what I saw last night, another man's footprints in her hotel room. I said it flatly. Jack's eyes flicked to Sally, and her panicked expression made it clear I was telling the truth. Jack slumped in his chair, his face crumpling as he covered it with his hands, whispering, Oh, God. Sally's face turned pale. Please, Dad, don't tell Mom. We can work this out, can't we? Please, Phil, she begged. I said nothing, just sifted through the old photos, lost in the pain of the past. After a few minutes, Jack straightened up, wiped his eyes, and asked, What are you going to do, Phil? He looked at Sally, whose tears hadn't stopped. I thought for a moment, then said, I never told either of you about Vietnam, or Ripcord. I sighed. Hell, I never told anyone about Ripcord, not even my therapist. I waved at the pile of photos on the table. Isn't it funny, Jack? Your generation proudly displays their war medals, while mine hides its memories in shoeboxes, locked away. I picked up an old, faded photo of 2 young soldiers in jungle uniforms, smiling like it was some casual outing. Jace and I were dropped at Ripcord in May 1971. It was just another base in our rotation, set up tools, supported the troops, and moved on. I paused, looking at Jack. But this time, it was different. We were stationed on a remote ridge near the Laos border, overlooking the A Shau Valley. It was a bad place for the U.S. military. Previous battles there had cost many lives. The Ripcord base was meant to support 4 battalions of the 101st Airborne, trying to stop the NVA from pushing down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. I shook my head. What a joke. The base had our 155 battery, a mortar platoon, and a company of infantry. We had 2 helicopter pads and a few other basic units, maybe 400 men at most. The whole base was underground, bunkers, trenches, tunnels. We didn't know until later that we were surrounded by 12,000 NVA soldiers. I met Jack's eyes. Does that remind you of anything, Jack? Like your Marines at Chosin Reservoir? Jack nodded slowly, lost in thought. After a moment of silence, I spoke. The first few weeks weren't so bad for us, I said. But for those dropped into combat positions on the hills, it was hell. Helicopters were in and out from dawn till dusk. We only took occasional sniper or automatic fire, but the incoming anti-aircraft fire grew stronger. I looked at Jack, then continued. On July 1st, everything changed. Just after 7 a.m., we took our first mortar fire. For the next week, the NVA bombarded us with 30 shells a day from 60 and 81 mm mortars. Then they started using 120 mm mortars, new weapons that had never been outside the DMZ. The worst part, I said, my voice trailing off, was that you couldn't always hear the shells coming. The wind, helicopters, and artillery fire made it hard to tell. One day, I was running from the mess hall to the bunker when a mortar blast knocked me down. I got to the bunker and Jace, looking up, said, "Damn, Phil, you're bleeding." I smiled weakly at the memory. I'd forgotten my body armor that day. Never again, I added with a sigh. The shrapnel shot me under my right shoulder blade. They evacuated me to Camp Evans to have it removed. It wasn't serious, but they kept me for a couple of days for a concussion. By the time I returned to Ripcord, we were taking 80 shells a day. It got heavier. Mortars, rocket-propelled grenades, recoilless tools. We were losing more men every day. Our tools were firing nonstop. We were using so much ammo the batteries ran out in hours. Chinooks brought in more shells, while .51 caliber NVA fire rained down on them. Once they dropped off ammo, we rushed in to load the tools. I paused, recalling the chaos. During one of these operations, I took another half-dozen shrapnel wounds. Between the constant bombardment, our regular work, and bringing ammo to the tools, we were beyond exhausted. Planes, F-4S, Phantoms, even B-52S, were constantly around, bombing the hills. Smoke and tear gas from the NVA lingered in the air. And after July 8th, when we first spotted the dinkies in the wire, we were on high alert every night. We knew an attack was coming, we just didn't know when. The room was quiet, the weight of the moment settling in. Jack's face was grim, and Sally looked like she was bracing herself. I took a deep breath. As the shelling continued, we started taking serious casualties. Morale was plummeting. We felt abandoned. Before it was over, I said quietly, we lost over 500 men, dead and wounded. I was assigned to carry body bags to the helipad for evacuation. I looked at Jack, my eyes filling. On July 18th, the worst thing happened. A Chinook carrying howitzer shells was hit and crashed over a battery and ammo supply point. The explosion was massive. The battery burst into flames and explosions kept going for hours. All 6 tools were destroyed and dozens of men were injured. I paused, the image still fresh. We rushed to the battery to help. Many of the wounded had severe burns from the aviation fuel. Jace and I lifted one machine gunner onto a stretcher. When I grabbed his arm, the skin came off in my hand. The smell of burning flesh. I'll never forget it. Jack nodded gravely, his face filled with grief. Sally looked horrified as I spoke. I wiped my eyes and pressed on. We all knew this position wouldn't hold, but the brass didn't care. They saw it as a chance to hit the enemy. After all, we had almost 4 NVA regiments in one spot. A few nights later, I said, my voice growing colder, we went on high alert. We were hit with automatic weapons fire around the perimeter. Jace and I set up an M60 in a trench in front of the FDC bunker, ready for an attack. The mortar platoon kept firing flares, and the infantry returned fire along the jungle's edge. Every few minutes, I continued, artillery ships flew overhead, firing rockets and miniguns at suspicious targets. Jace and I didn't return fire often, to avoid drawing attention to our position, especially since there was an infantry squad just 30 yards ahead. This night, I went on, my tone distant, the infantry kept popping up and firing grenades and automatic weapons. Then suddenly, 20 mm mortar rounds hit their position. The ground shook as we dove into our foxhole. I paused, the danger still fresh in my mind. When we peeked out, the infantry trench was completely buried. We quickly took up firing positions, and Jace started shooting while I fed him ammo. The platoon sergeant crawled over, and we told him what happened. He nodded, ducked down, and rushed off for more ammo. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to continue. Just as we were finishing the last ammo belt, I heard an M16 shot. It felt like being hit with a baseball bat in my back and thighs. I collapsed on the edge of the trench, staring into Jace's eyes. I saw the realization in his face, but he couldn't speak. I held his hand. He squeezed it once, then the light left his eyes. I knew it was over. My throat tightened. My best friend, my brother, was gone. I felt completely alone. I wiped my eyes again, hearing Sally sniffle, but I wasn't sure whether it was for Jace or her own emotions. I took a deep breath and went on. I looked up to see Corporal Tran standing in front of us, an M16 aimed at us. Tran was one of Kit Carson's scouts, a North Vietnamese deserter. He fired a whole clip at us. I took a couple of bullets in my back, but my body armor saved me from worse, though I had broken ribs and a severe concussion. One bullet shot my thigh but didn't hit bone. I started to go into shock, realizing Jace was gone and I'd been shot. I paused, steadying myself. I fought to stay conscious. I couldn't let myself pass out. I focused on anger, thinking of getting revenge on the enemy. As the rage built, my vision blurred, and my mind clouded with hatred. Tran noticed I was moving and tried to shoot again, but he had emptied his clip. I played dead, and he must have decided I was done. He dropped his rifle, jumped over our trench, and started waving a flashlight, shouting in Vietnamese. I pressed on, shaking as I recalled the chaos. Then a rocket-propelled grenade flew from the bushes, narrowly missing both of us. Tran kept waving his flashlight like a madman. Through the flare light, I saw 3 figures, sappers, emerge from the jungle, wearing satchel charges and holding AK-47s. I barely had the strength to stand, but I grabbed the M60 beneath Jace and aimed at them. I fired 2 long bursts before the belt ran out. The sappers went down, and Tran stared at me, shocked. He screamed, spitting as he grabbed a machete from his belt. Most scouts carried them to navigate the jungle, I added. I barely had time to get my foot on the trench's edge and push off before Tran lunged at me. I dropped the M60 and grabbed my knife. We were almost unconscious, but I managed to get on top of him. He reached for the machete, but never got it. I closed my eyes, my voice barely a whisper. I don't know how long I sat there, surrounded by the flickering light of flares, explosions, tracer rounds, howitzers rumbling, and the smell of cordite and burning debris. It felt like I was in hell. I continued hoarsely. Eric, my platoon sergeant, pulled me by one arm and Lieutenant Dixon by the other. Dixon was shouting for me to get to the bunker, napalm was coming, and we were too close to the wire. I took a sip of beer, tracing my knife across the purple hearts on the table. Jack and Sally were silent. I couldn't bring myself to look at them. I went on. That's when I lost consciousness. I woke up in a medical bunker with an IV in my arm. A battalion surgeon and corpsmen were working on me. Doc said I'd probably survive and that they'd evacuate me at dawn, I added, my voice shaky. I was flown out around noon, miraculously. Every helicopter was under heavy fire. 2 had already been shot down. Mine took several hits, one that liquidated the crew commander. But by then, they'd decided to evacuate Ripcord. I paused, looking at the table. They took everyone out on the 21st and bombed the place. I didn't care. 24 hours later, I was on a flight to Japan, then transferred to Walter Reed for a month. I sighed deeply. While I was there, some colonel who probably never heard of Ripcord handed me a medal for eliminating my enemies. I took the silver star from the box and placed it beside the purple hearts. It was the same one on Jack's mantle. I shook my head. The doctors treated me well, but mentally I wasn't fine. I had nightmares every night, couldn't shake the sounds, smells, and faces of the dead and wounded. I paused, looking away. I missed Jace's funeral, but went home before reporting to SIL Base. I visited Jace's parents. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. They wanted to know about Vietnam, what happened to Jace, but didn't ask a single question. I swallowed, struggling to speak. Why did I survive and he didn't? I said softly. I ask myself that every day. I stared blankly ahead, lost in thought. I was in therapy, but felt withdrawn from the world. I did the bare minimum at Fort Sill and buried myself in college drafting to avoid socializing. When I left the Army, I moved back with my parents and went to school, not because I cared, but because I didn't know what else to do. I looked up at Sally. Then I met you, I whispered. Sally lowered her gaze, her voice trembling. You brought me back to life. You were happy, engaged in everything, beautiful inside and out. Everything I thought I wasn't. You made me want to live again. You gave me a glimpse of what life could be. She paused, her voice breaking. I fell in love with you. You saved me, and you gave me 3 beautiful children. I'll always be grateful for that. I sighed. For a while, we just sat there, not moving. Finally, Jack cleared his throat. What now, Phil? I turned to him, tired. Jack, I've been betrayed twice in my life. Both times I lost my best friend. Sally started sobbing. No, no, no. The room was silent. Sally cried. Jack and I had tears in our eyes. Jack asked quietly, Are you sure, Phil, you want to throw it all away over one mistake? Sally lifted her head, a flicker of hope in her eyes. I knew what I had to say would end our marriage, but I couldn't let the lie stand. I shook my head. The mistake wasn't just one, Jack. I looked at Sally, my voice firm. I found out last night that Sally's been cheating on me for almost 2 years, and it wasn't just with one man. Sally sighed, closed her eyes, and shook her head, sinking deeper into her chair, looking even paler than before. I turned to Jack. Does that answer your question? I asked. Jack stood up slowly, his eyes full of sorrow as he looked at Sally. You're my daughter, and I should love you, but I've lost all respect for you, your actions. He trailed off, unable to find the words, just shaking his head. Sally reached out, but Jack pulled away. He looked at me and said firmly, Phil, you don't deserve this. Do what you have to do, but don't hurt her. I couldn't take it anymore. No, Jack, I'm beyond that, I replied. But if it makes you feel better, take this. I slipped the knife back into its sheath and handed it to him. Jack accepted it silently, then turned to leave. His shoulders slumped, and I could tell he was already thinking about how to tell Emily when the door closed behind him. The phone rang, but neither of us moved or spoke. The ringing eventually stopped, and the silence was deafening. Finally, I broke it, staring blankly ahead. I thought the cops would be here this morning, not your father. Sally flinched and stumbled over her words. Debbie and I told them to say we were attacked outside the bar. We hoped if they kept quiet, you wouldn't call their wives. I processed this, realizing I was free. There was no way their story would hold up. For a moment, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but then I remembered everything was falling apart around me. So, where are they now? I asked flatly. Sally cleared her throat, fidgeting in her chair. They're still in the hospital, under observation. You hurt them badly. John has a broken nose, cheekbone, and ribs. Craig has a dislocated jaw, broken teeth, and a concussion. I replied bluntly, Don't forget their balls, Sally. Fear filled her eyes. No, no, you really hurt them. She paused, then added, I didn't know you were so cruel, Phil. Did you have to do that? I stared at her, incredulous. You're defending those fools? I said sarcastically. Before she could respond, the phone rang again. You should answer it, I said, heading to the bathroom. It's probably for you. I washed my face, looking at myself in the mirror. My eyes were red and puffy. I looked as worn down as I felt. It had been a sleepless night. Back in the kitchen, Sally was standing there, staring at the phone. Slowly, she hung it up and collapsed into a chair. When I sat back down, she spoke, her voice distant. Did you have to tell Debbie's husband? I shrugged. Why shouldn't I? He already called John and Craig's wives and kicked Debbie out. She's going to need a lawyer if she wants to see her daughter. Sally started crying again. Crap, crap, crap. Through her tears, she looked up at me. And she fired me. Said it was all my fault. I laughed bitterly. Oh, that's just perfect. I paused. Tell me, Sally, who introduced you to John and Craig? It was Debbie, wasn't it? Through sniffles, she asked. How did you know? I smiled grimly. When I told Josh about what you and Debbie did last night, he didn't believe me. Called me a liar, accused me of trying to ruin his marriage. But when I mentioned John Harrison's name, he turned pale and started swearing. First time I ever saw him angry. I paused. You told me years ago that Debbie's second marriage was strained and she was estranged from her parents. Well, she has a sister upstate she doesn't talk to either. I took a breath. About a year ago, Josh was auditing a company and met Sarah, Debbie's sister. They hit it off, and one night, Sarah invited him to dinner with her husband, Dave. Sarah had a story to tell. I looked at Sally, whose face had gone white with shock. Turns out Dave was Debbie's first husband. She cheated on him throughout their marriage. He found out, kicked her out, and filed for divorce. I stopped, watching Sally's reaction. Debbie never told Josh any of this. And guess who she had an affair with during her first marriage? That's right, John Harrison. Sally froze. I continued. When I mentioned John's name, Josh put the pieces together and realized Debbie had been doing the same thing to him that you did to me. No wonder he threw her out. I took a deep breath. And like Josh, I'm wondering how long you've been fooling around with me, I said firmly. Sally cried again. Oh my God, Phil. It was just John and Craig, just during our shopping trips. Please believe me. I hadn't thought about anyone else until Debbie mentioned it. Before our first shopping trip, she sat there, twirling a handkerchief, crying and begging. Please, Phil. I don't know how I ended up here. It's like I woke up from a nightmare. When I walked into the bathroom and saw you there, I didn't say anything, just looked at her grimly. Encouraged, she spoke quickly. I knew Debbie liked to play, but I didn't expect her to hook up with anyone on our trip. She paused, biting her lip. John showed up at the restaurant. Debbie said she'd known him since high school, but I suspected that wasn't true. He was charming, flirted, danced with both of us, complimented me a lot. I had a few more drinks than usual, and when his hands got too familiar on the dance floor, I pretended not to notice. Later, Debbie went with John to the room next to ours. I realized she set the whole thing up. The walls were thin, and I could hear them all night. That explains why you were like that when you came home, right? I looked at her with disgust. Sally, you're unbelievable. Sally hung her head and wiped her eyes. The next morning, John was gone. We had breakfast, and Debbie went on and on about their night together, raving about him the whole way home. She paused, then added, over the next few months, Debbie and I had lunch a couple times a week. She'd always talk about John and how much fun they had. That's when I first heard about his wart, Sally said softly. Debbie joked I should try it, but at first I just laughed it off. The more she talked, though, the more the idea stuck in my head. A few months later, when another shopping trip came up, Debbie confessed that John really wanted to be with me, and she didn't mind. I laughed, but I asked her what she'd do if I went along with it, Sally continued. She said John had a friend, Craig, who would keep her company. I didn't say no, though I don't know why. I told her I'd think about it, but I wasn't sure I could. Sally looked at me, but I just stared back blankly. I knew it was wrong, Phil, but I thought I could do it and no one would ever know. She looked down again, her voice soft. That Saturday night, John and Craig came to the restaurant. We had dinner, drinks, and then went to a nightclub. We split into couples, and I ended up with John. I'd had enough to drink by then and convinced myself it was fine. Everyone was having a great time. Later, we went back to the motel, and John and I went to our room while Debbie and Craig went to theirs. Sally fell silent, staring at her hands. I finally spoke dismissively. So, was it what you expected? Sally looked at me with tears in her eyes. It was fine. It wasn't better than what we have, but it was exciting because it was wrong, and I could pretend to be someone else. You mean it wasn't just okay? I said bitterly. He turned you on so much that you forgot about your husband at home? The one who takes care of the kids so you could be alone? Sally turned away, fighting a sob. Yes, she whispered. And Craig, my husband, I said sarcastically. Without looking at me, she replied. After we slept with John a few times, Debbie joked she was starting to miss him. I didn't think much about it, but the next trip, when we split into couples, I danced with Craig most of the night. Later, he came to my room and we spent the night together. It didn't seem like a big deal. Then, a couple trips later, John and Craig swapped in the middle of the night. I didn't realize at first until I woke up and realized the man in my bed wasn't the one I started with. Sally looked at me sadly. I felt like two different people living in two different worlds. I liked our life, our family, but I got hooked on those weekends. I thought I could have both, and you'd never find out. How stupid was I? Damn stupid, I agreed. And then when you saw me at the motel, I looked in the mirror and realized what I had become, she whispered. I stood up and looked down at her. Interesting story, Sally. Too bad it doesn't have a happy ending. Or maybe it does for you. I'm going to get the kids. Tonight, after Allie's asleep, we'll sit down with Jason and Jesse and tell them their parents will be living apart. I'll leave out the details to minimize the trauma. I'll sleep on the couch until I figure out what comes next, Sally shouted after me, crying. Phil, don't do this. I love you. Please, don't. I turned to her. Why not? Through sobs, she begged. It was only a few nights a year. I never saw John or Craig outside those weekends. Please, Phil, forgive me. Let me fix it. Forgive you? I shook my head. Forgive you for being a promiscuous for other men a few nights a year? For giving away the thing you valued most? Yourself? For destroying my trust? My belief that we belong to each other? I sighed. And how do you fix that? Can you undo it? Can you not be with John or Craig? Because that's what it takes to make it right. I looked around the kitchen. The family photos, the kids' drawings, Allie's baby chair in the corner, everything that made this place a home. I spent most of last night thinking about how I'll feel in 6 months, a year, or 5 years. I might forgive you, but I won't forget. I paused, my voice breaking. Every time I see you, I'll remember last night. Every time I hear your voice or your name, I'll think of it. And that, Sally, I can't live with. I stood silently for a moment, barely noticing Sally rocking back and forth, crying, whispering, "No, please, God, no." A few minutes later, I spoke softly. "Can you answer me one question, Sally?" She looked up at me, empty-eyed, like a condemned prisoner awaiting the sentence. "You lost the man who loved you more than anything. You lost the respect of your parents, my parents, and me. You lost your job. And someday, you'll have to explain to our children why you destroyed our family. Was it worth it?" After a long silence, broken only by her sobs, I turned and slowly walked out the door.
Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
I'm 44 years old, male, and have been married for 10 years. My wife is 41, and we've been together for 13 years. We also have an 8-year-old son, and overall, we're quite happy with our lives. However, this isn't my first marriage. I got married at 22, but unfortunately, that marriage ended in divorce within 3 years for reasons that I'm still not fully aware of. My first wife, whom I'll call Kathy, yes, I know it is always a Kathy, just live with it. She was with me since middle school. We were basically childhood sweethearts. After graduating college and landing decent jobs, we decided to get married. Things were fine for the first couple of years, but then, for some reason, things started to feel off between us. I tried my best to keep the spark alive, but it seemed like she lost interest. No matter what I did, it felt like I was fighting a losing battle. A couple of weeks before our 3rd anniversary, Kathy handed me divorce papers and told me she was done. I wanted to work on our marriage. I just needed one reason why we had to give up after so long. But she couldn't give me any answers beyond saying she just wasn't in love with me anymore. I was devastated but felt powerless to change her mind. Ultimately, I decided to go through with the divorce because I didn't want to be with her anymore, and dragging the process would only cause me more harm. It was one of the toughest decisions I've ever had to make. But I knew I had to accept her choice, even if it left me heartbroken. After the divorce, things went relatively smoothly since we didn't have many joint assets, making the process straightforward. However, once it was finalized, I didn't see Amy again. I heard from a couple of friends that she moved to a different city and cut off contact with everyone, which was understandable given the circumstances. What struck me as really strange, though, was how my family reacted. Instead of being supportive during such a difficult time, they began distancing themselves from me around the same time as the divorce. It was confusing and hurtful. I thought they would be there for me. I tried to keep in touch, but I soon realized I had been blocked on social media and other platforms. In a couple of attempts to reach out, I even went to visit them, but neither my parents nor my sister would answer the door. It was a lonely and isolating experience, especially since I was already struggling with my emotions post-divorce. For a couple of years, I found it hard to motivate myself and ended up quitting my job, spending several months unemployed and lost. Despite the pain, I was incredibly lucky to have friends who stood by me. They encouraged me to focus on self-improvement and motivated me to move on. Their support helped me navigate through that dark period and begin to rebuild my life. After the divorce, my family was never really there for me, so my friends stepped up and took care of me during that tough time. Their support was invaluable, and it inspired me to pursue a long-held dream of mine, opening my own restaurant. Throughout my marriage to Kathy, I had always pushed this dream aside to save money and think about our future together. But now that I was on my own, I felt it was time to make it happen. With the help of my friends, I reached out to a couple of investors who were willing to back my vision. I used the name that my parents had suggested for the restaurant, creating a personal connection to my family while also forging my own path. It took a lot of hard work and perseverance, but within a few years, I was able to open my first restaurant. It took nearly 4 years after the divorce for me to truly get back on my feet, and 2 years after that, I met my wife. We connected through mutual friends at a party, and she mentioned how much she loved my restaurant. That sparked our conversation, and we hit it off. After 3 years of dating, I decided to give love another chance and asked her to marry me. Now, 10 years later, we have a wonderful life together, along with our 8-year-old son. Looking back, I can see how far I've come since those difficult days, and I feel grateful for the support and love I've found along the way. It's not just my personal life that has improved over the past couple of years. My professional life has also taken a significant turn for the better. It all began with my restaurant, which became successful enough that we slowly started to expand. Thanks to that initial success, I'm now the CEO of my own hospitality group, and we own a semi-popular chain of restaurants and hotels. We're currently planning to expand beyond the state, aiming for greater recognition and success. It's been an uphill battle, but I've worked incredibly hard to get where I am. So, when I was invited to sit for an interview recently, I felt it was a sign that I had truly made it. I agreed to the interview, thinking it would just be a good opportunity to share my journey and maybe inspire others. However, I had no idea that this would lead to such a storm in my life. After the interview aired on a moderately popular news channel, my family decided to reach out to me. I was surprised because, after all this time, I didn't expect them to come back into my life, especially not after they had distanced themselves so completely following my divorce. To my shock, just 3 days ago, they showed up at my office unannounced. When the receptionist informed me that my family was waiting outside, I initially thought it was my wife and son. It would have been odd since my wife was at work and my son was at school, but I was ready to embrace them. Then the receptionist clarified that it was my parents and sister who were there. Seeing them after so long was an overwhelming experience. I had so many mixed emotions: surprise, confusion, and even a hint of anger at their sudden reappearance after years of silence. I wasn't sure how to handle the situation, especially since they had chosen to come to my workplace, where I was in the middle of a busy day. It felt inappropriate for them to demand my time when I was focused on my business. I had built a new life for myself, and their unexpected visit stirred up a lot of old feelings and questions. What could they possibly want after all this time? It was then that I started finding it difficult to process what was going on. I told the receptionist to inform my family that I would see them later, but for now, they needed to leave. Of course, they didn't take that well and began throwing a tantrum. I didn't want security to throw them out before I had a chance to speak with them, so I reluctantly went to meet them in the lobby. As soon as they saw me, it was as if nothing had changed since the last time we were together, nearly 20 years ago. They started fawning over me, showering me with compliments about how great it was that I had become successful enough to make it onto the news. They described my story as inspiring, which felt surreal. After all this time, they were suddenly acting like they had always been supportive, even though they had distanced themselves when I needed them most. I tried to brush it off, insisting that I had to get back to work, but then they brought up my family. During my interview, I had shared a bit about my wife and son, highlighting how crucial they had been in my journey. I must admit, it felt strange to have them mention this part of my life. These were moments they hadn't been a part of, yet they were now eager to connect with it. They started expressing a desire to meet my wife and their grandson, claiming they had spent too long away from us. Hearing that made my heart race. Part of me was curious about what they wanted, but another part felt defensive. At that point, they started telling me that I hadn't put in enough effort to get in touch with them after the divorce and that I should have tried harder. This caught me off guard, but I realized that I might finally be able to get some clarity about what had happened back then. I decided to let them talk instead of dismissing them, even taking a seat in the lobby with them so I could get to the bottom of things and hopefully find some closure. As they spoke, I uncovered the real reason why Kathy had decided to divorce me and why my family had distanced themselves from me during that time. I know you might have figured it out already, but yes, Kathy had been cheating on me. I had never had a clue, and to my shock, my parents had been helping to cover it up all along. Now, I know that might seem harsh, but my parents had their reasons. At least, according to them, these were valid reasons to help their daughter-in-law cheat on their son. Apparently, the person Kathy was having an affair with was my cousin, my dad's brother's son. It was a devastating revelation that explained so much about the years of confusion and heartbreak I had experienced. My mind raced as I processed this information. All those times I had been left in the dark, grappling with feelings of betrayal and abandonment, were now being unraveled. My family's actions made a sickening kind of sense now, and I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. How could they betray me like that? And how could Kathy, someone I thought I knew so well, have done this to me? It was hard to reconcile their claims of being supportive with the reality of their actions. When they finally told me all of that, everything seemed to fall into place almost immediately. It made sense why they had helped her, why I hadn't been invited to any family events for the past 20 years, and why I had been completely cast aside for no fault of my own. My cousin, let's call him Carl, was a spoiled, entitled brat, and I had always disliked him. Unfortunately, because his mother had passed away when he was just 6 months old, my family seemed to think he deserved a free pass for everything he did. Throughout his life, nobody had bothered to teach him how to behave, and he always got away with everything. It didn't help that my uncle was my dad's boss since he had started the family business and my dad had joined him later. After my marriage, when Carl decided he wanted to be with Kathy and she was on board with it too, my family felt they had no choice but to help them out. They couldn't risk my uncle's anger, and putting their relationship with me at risk was an easily justifiable sacrifice in their eyes. They explained that after the divorce, my uncle made it very clear that he didn't want anyone in the family to have any contact with me at all, including my parents and sister. It felt like a dagger to my heart, realizing that the people who were supposed to support me had chosen to protect someone who had hurt me deeply instead. I was left feeling completely betrayed, not just by Kathy, but by the family I had always thought would stand by me. Apparently, my family had tried to protest when Kathy first started pulling away from me, but then she announced that she was pregnant with my child. That was the turning point. They felt they had no choice but to cut ties with me if they ever wanted to have any relationship with their grandkid. It's hard to believe that I was never notified about Kathy's pregnancy when she filed for divorce. She had moved out long before it was finalized, so I had no clue that I had become a father long before my son was born. To add to the shock, I learned that I have a daughter who is almost 20 now, and she has never even known me. She thinks Carl is her real father. The enormity of this revelation was overwhelming. It felt surreal, like I was being told a story rather than receiving the reality of my life. I had spent years trying to understand the pain of my past, only to find out that my family had essentially cut me off in favor of having a relationship with their grandchild and, in their minds, maintaining job security. I felt a mix of anger and betrayal. They had made a cowardly choice, prioritizing their own comfort over standing by me during a tumultuous time in my life. All those years of silence, isolation, and questioning my worth, only to learn that it was all because they wanted to protect their own interests. They could have easily approached me with the truth and allowed me to deal with the situation, but instead, they chose to let fear of my dad's brother dictate their actions, as if he could do any real harm beyond firing my father from the business. Even in that case, my dad could have retaliated with a lawsuit. As for not telling me about Kathy's pregnancy and the fact that I have a daughter, I can't fathom any justification for that. For 20 years, they kept this secret and never spoke up until they discovered I was doing well in life. Suddenly, they were filled with remorse and wanted to make amends. Unfortunately for them, I saw right through their act. Once they finished telling me everything, I told them I needed them to leave because, at that moment, I couldn't find it in my heart to forgive them. I tried to remain civil since we were in the lobby of my workplace and I didn't want to cause a scene, but I couldn't expect them to behave similarly. When I expressed my desire for them to leave, they immediately started whining, insisting that I needed to consider where they were coming from and how difficult the situation had been for them as well. I told them I knew for a fact that they were reaching out to me now solely because I had found success and they wanted a piece of it. They vehemently denied it, with my sister even going so far as to claim that I owed my success to them. By that, she clearly meant that I had used the name they suggested for my restaurant back when it was just a dream. I found it incredibly bold for her to make such a claim, especially considering I hadn't received any of their support over the years. I had built everything on my own, with help from my friends, not them. Merely suggesting a name didn't give them the right to take credit for my achievements, and it was such a ridiculous notion that I ended up laughing at her. I told her that if she and my parents didn't leave immediately, I would have them forcibly removed from the building. They immediately started arguing, insisting they weren't going anywhere until we cleared the air. But honestly, I wasn't interested in that. So I followed through with my threat and had them thrown out by security. They were naturally upset during the ejection, trying to tell me they had no choice in this matter, but I didn't buy it. They definitely had a choice. They just made the wrong one, and now they have to face the consequences. It hasn't been difficult for them to go without seeing me and my family for the past 20 years, so I'm sure they can manage the future just fine as well. Anyway, it's been 3 days since that confrontation, and they haven't stopped trying to reach me. They've been texting me on social media, sending emails to my work address, and even showing up at my office, though they haven't had the nerve to come inside again. There's been a noticeable shift in their attitude. Now, all their messages are filled with apologies. Even when I see them waiting outside my workplace, they look genuinely upset and hopeful for a chance to talk, but I just drive by and ignore them. To be honest, it's reached a point where I almost feel a bit sorry for them. I've discussed this with my wife because, regardless of what I decide to do about my family, we still need to think about my daughter, whom I didn't even know existed until a few days ago. We've been going back and forth on whether we should try to trace my daughter and reach out to her. On top of that, my family hasn't given up. I doubt they'll go anywhere until they get another chance to speak with me. My wife thinks it might be worth it to invite them over and try to clear the air. She believes that addressing the toxicity could be beneficial for my emotional health. However, I have no interest in doing anything like that. I just want to continue ignoring them until they go away on their own. I simply don't have the capacity to deal with them right now, especially with everything I've recently learned. So, we're struggling to figure out how to handle this situation. I want to ask if it's unreasonable for me not to want to give my parents a chance to speak to me after 20 years of no contact. It's been a week and 3 days since I posted, and my wife and I have decided to continue ignoring my family. Thankfully, they haven't shown up at my workplace for the past couple of days. Maybe they've finally gotten tired of it or felt intimidated by security, but whatever the reason, I'm relieved. Once they stopped showing up, it became much easier for me to stop thinking about them. I guess it was just their presence that was making me feel guilty about my choices. However, I no longer feel guilty about ignoring their messages. They can keep apologizing all they want, but it won't change anything. The truth is, they've failed me as a family, and no amount of apologies can make that right again. They continue to send messages from various accounts and email addresses, but I'm not even bothering to block them anymore. What's the point? They'll just create new ones to try to reach out to me, and I'll keep ignoring it all. Let's see how long they can keep this up and how sincere their apologies really are. Now, onto the other issue my wife and I are dealing with, our daughter. We have her full name and know where she goes to college since my parents mentioned it during our conversation. My assistant even managed to find her social media accounts for me, but so far, I haven't taken any action. I'm unsure whether it's appropriate to reach out or how to tell her that I'm her biological father. The whole situation feels overwhelming, and I want to approach it the right way. Since she's not a minor, I can't just show up at Kathy's house demanding custody or anything like that. Honestly, I'd prefer to keep her out of this mess entirely, especially after everything I've discovered about Kathy and my family. I've lost all respect for them. They're just a bunch of spineless cowards. However, I can't say the same about my daughter. No matter who raised her, she's still my flesh and blood. So finally, my wife and I decided to go for it. There was no point in waiting for the perfect moment to reach out to my daughter. We just needed to rip off the Band-Aid. Since she lives in a different state, we figured it wouldn't be right to fly out to her. So we decided to send her a message first and see how she responds. We reached out to her on Instagram and explained everything as gently as we could. Now, we're just waiting for her reply. I'm sure it's going to be really complicated to come to terms with everything. It's complicated for me as well, and I can't even grasp how my wife has managed to be so supportive while I reach out to the daughter I never knew I had with my ex-wife. I'm certain there are a lot of mixed emotions for all of us, but we're doing our best. I genuinely hope my daughter responds because I would love to build a relationship with her. As for my parents, they haven't shown up at my workplace in a while. Yesterday, they sent me a lengthy email expressing their remorse about everything and their genuine desire to repair our relationship. They asked for one chance and mentioned they wouldn't reach out again. Instead, they'd wait for me to contact them. Honestly, I'm relieved they've taken the hint and realized that I'm not ready to speak with them right now. I have enough on my plate already, and the last thing I need is for them to stir up more drama. I'm just hoping they stick to what they said and don't reach out to me again. If I feel ready or want to speak with them at any point, I'll do so myself. However, right now, it seems very unlikely that will happen anytime soon. Knowing the real reason they hadn't spoken to me in 20 years has made things much worse. I feel betrayed and hurt, and I doubt those feelings will fade anytime soon. At least one good thing came from this. I discovered I have a daughter, and I really hope she decides to give our relationship a chance. I haven't told my son yet, just in case she doesn't want to talk to us. I wouldn't want to give him false hope. But if things go well, he might find a sister in her, and I could get to know the daughter I never knew I had. I'm just overwhelmed with emotions right now, trying hard to keep it all together. So almost 2 weeks ago, I reached out to my daughter on social media and sent her a message explaining everything about who I am and how we're related. After waiting for 2 weeks, I finally got a text back today. She didn't say much, just that she spoke to her mother about me after my message and found out that I'm her biological father. Obviously, this must have come as a shock to her because for the past 20 years, she believed that Carl was her biological father and had no idea she wasn't his daughter. She also learned the real story about how her mother and I ended up in this situation, and she told me that she would like to meet me and my family. So, we're all flying out to see her this weekend since she isn't speaking to her family right now and doesn't have the funds to come see us. She didn't go into detail, but when she confronted Kathy about my message, Kathy initially tried to deny it. Eventually, she was forced to tell her the truth. I haven't heard from Kathy yet, and I really hope she doesn't contact me because I don't want to speak to her. Unfortunately, my family broke their promise immediately and started trying to talk to me as soon as they learned I had reached out to my daughter. Apparently, my uncle was furious that I found out about the situation. Naturally, he has reason to be upset since they spent 20 years trying to ensure I never discovered the truth, fearing I would cause trouble in their lives. Now that I finally know, my uncle is holding my parents accountable for everything. To complicate matters, my dad no longer works for my uncle, as he is now independent, yet he seems terrified of his older brother. He has been begging me to tell my uncle or Carl, or anyone else, that they had nothing to do with this and that I discovered the truth on my own. Somehow, even if I did tell my family that I found out on my own, I think it's highly unlikely anyone would believe it. They're the only ones who would do something like this, and since I haven't been close to most of my family and they haven't bothered to speak to me in the past 20 years, it's funny how desperate they're acting right now just to maintain their relationship with my uncle. But honestly, I don't really care. It was because of them that I didn't have a relationship with my daughter for 20 years, so I think this is really the least they can do. My family and I finally met my daughter. It was weird at first, then really emotional, but mostly it was just beautiful. She seems to be a genuinely kind and good person, which is surprising considering she was raised by two of the cruelest and most horrible people I know. But I guess they did a decent job raising her, or maybe it's just her own innate nature. Regardless, she seems to be really intelligent and mature. We had a long chat about how things were going with Kathy and her father. She told me that, naturally, they weren't on board with her meeting us, but she didn't care. After finding out the truth, she realized she simply didn't care what her parents thought. They haven't had any other children after her, so she doesn't think she'll abandon them forever, but she's definitely planning to distance herself from them for a while to process everything. She mentioned that she needs some time to start building a relationship with me as well, and I completely understand where she's coming from. Overall, we had a really nice time together, and she seemed to get along well with my wife and her half-brother. We had dinner, during which she revealed that my parents, her grandparents, had been in touch with her all along. She always found it strange how emotional they were about her, considering they weren't her actual grandparents. Now it all makes sense why they were so attached to her. However, after everything she's discovered, she sees all of them in a different light, and so do I. I can completely understand how she feels. Well, maybe not entirely since I'm much older, and she's just 20, but I can't imagine it's a lot harder for her. She's been lied to her entire life by the people she thought were the closest to her, and that must be incredibly difficult to reconcile. Both of us are going to have to work on this, and I'm hopeful that the future will be better. I know it has to be because we're committed to making it the best it can be. What truly brings me joy is that the meeting went well, and my family seems to be content with everything that has happened, as do I. I feel quite at peace with the situation, regardless of what my family or Kathy and Carl have done. What matters most is that after so many years, we finally have a chance to make things right, and I'm determined to make the most of that opportunity. As I left work that evening, a strange sense of peace washed over me. I had just met my daughter, and we had begun to bridge the chasm created by years of lies. But that calm was shattered when I spotted my uncle and Carl waiting for me in the parking lot, their faces twisted in anger. "What do you think you're doing, playing family with her?" My uncle spat, venom dripping from his words. "You're nothing to her, just a biological accident." Carl stepped forward, fists clenched and ready to fight. "You don't get to waltz back into her life after all these years. Stay away from her, or you'll regret it." I could feel the rage bubbling up inside me. "You think you can intimidate me? You've already destroyed enough lives. I'm not afraid of you." In a heartbeat, the confrontation escalated. I lunged at Carl, throwing a punch that connected hard with his jaw, sending him staggering back. My uncle charged me, but I sidestepped and delivered a swift kick that sent him crashing into a parked car. What followed was a brutal exchange. I fought like a man possessed, driven by years of pent-up frustration. Each punch I landed was a release, a cathartic explosion of anger and hurt. I could see the shock on their faces as I unleashed everything I had. In mere moments, they were on the ground, gasping for breath. The sight of them, bruised and defeated, felt like justice for all the years of betrayal they had inflicted upon me. I stood over them, my chest heaving with adrenaline. "Consider this a warning," I said, my voice low and steady. "Stay out of my life, and stay away from my daughter. She deserves better than the lies you've fed her." Just as the weight of my anger began to lift, I heard sirens approaching. I turned to see the police arriving, summoned by onlookers who witnessed the scene. I stood there, still buzzing from the fight, as they handcuffed my uncle and Carl, their faces a mix of humiliation and fury. They were charged with trespassing and criminal intimidation, their threats now a joke. I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone to call my parents. I knew I needed to make my boundaries clear. Stay away from me and my family. You've done enough damage. I'm cutting ties with all of you. This is the last time I'll ask. I hung up feeling a strange mix of relief and finality. I wouldn't let them hurt me any longer. Meanwhile, my daughter was making her own choices. After hearing the full story of the deception and manipulation from her adoptive family, she decided to cut ties with them, too. I don't need them in my life anymore, she told me, her voice steady and resolute. They lied to me for so long. I want to start fresh with you and your family. In that moment, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I had fought for something real and meaningful, and now we had a chance to build a future together, free from the shadows of betrayal. Together, we would forge a new path, and this time, we wouldn't look back. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
Welcome to Lost Relation Chronicles.
I'm 44 years old, male, and have been married for 10 years. My wife is 41, and we've been together for 13 years. We also have an 8-year-old son, and overall, we're quite happy with our lives. However, this isn't my first marriage. I got married at 22, but unfortunately, that marriage ended in divorce within 3 years for reasons that I'm still not fully aware of. My first wife, whom I'll call Kathy, yes, I know it is always a Kathy, just live with it. She was with me since middle school. We were basically childhood sweethearts. After graduating college and landing decent jobs, we decided to get married. Things were fine for the first couple of years, but then, for some reason, things started to feel off between us. I tried my best to keep the spark alive, but it seemed like she lost interest. No matter what I did, it felt like I was fighting a losing battle. A couple of weeks before our 3rd anniversary, Kathy handed me divorce papers and told me she was done. I wanted to work on our marriage. I just needed one reason why we had to give up after so long. But she couldn't give me any answers beyond saying she just wasn't in love with me anymore. I was devastated but felt powerless to change her mind. Ultimately, I decided to go through with the divorce because I didn't want to be with her anymore, and dragging the process would only cause me more harm. It was one of the toughest decisions I've ever had to make. But I knew I had to accept her choice, even if it left me heartbroken. After the divorce, things went relatively smoothly since we didn't have many joint assets, making the process straightforward. However, once it was finalized, I didn't see Amy again. I heard from a couple of friends that she moved to a different city and cut off contact with everyone, which was understandable given the circumstances. What struck me as really strange, though, was how my family reacted. Instead of being supportive during such a difficult time, they began distancing themselves from me around the same time as the divorce. It was confusing and hurtful. I thought they would be there for me. I tried to keep in touch, but I soon realized I had been blocked on social media and other platforms. In a couple of attempts to reach out, I even went to visit them, but neither my parents nor my sister would answer the door. It was a lonely and isolating experience, especially since I was already struggling with my emotions post-divorce. For a couple of years, I found it hard to motivate myself and ended up quitting my job, spending several months unemployed and lost. Despite the pain, I was incredibly lucky to have friends who stood by me. They encouraged me to focus on self-improvement and motivated me to move on. Their support helped me navigate through that dark period and begin to rebuild my life. After the divorce, my family was never really there for me, so my friends stepped up and took care of me during that tough time. Their support was invaluable, and it inspired me to pursue a long-held dream of mine, opening my own restaurant. Throughout my marriage to Kathy, I had always pushed this dream aside to save money and think about our future together. But now that I was on my own, I felt it was time to make it happen. With the help of my friends, I reached out to a couple of investors who were willing to back my vision. I used the name that my parents had suggested for the restaurant, creating a personal connection to my family while also forging my own path. It took a lot of hard work and perseverance, but within a few years, I was able to open my first restaurant. It took nearly 4 years after the divorce for me to truly get back on my feet, and 2 years after that, I met my wife. We connected through mutual friends at a party, and she mentioned how much she loved my restaurant. That sparked our conversation, and we hit it off. After 3 years of dating, I decided to give love another chance and asked her to marry me. Now, 10 years later, we have a wonderful life together, along with our 8-year-old son. Looking back, I can see how far I've come since those difficult days, and I feel grateful for the support and love I've found along the way. It's not just my personal life that has improved over the past couple of years. My professional life has also taken a significant turn for the better. It all began with my restaurant, which became successful enough that we slowly started to expand. Thanks to that initial success, I'm now the CEO of my own hospitality group, and we own a semi-popular chain of restaurants and hotels. We're currently planning to expand beyond the state, aiming for greater recognition and success. It's been an uphill battle, but I've worked incredibly hard to get where I am. So, when I was invited to sit for an interview recently, I felt it was a sign that I had truly made it. I agreed to the interview, thinking it would just be a good opportunity to share my journey and maybe inspire others. However, I had no idea that this would lead to such a storm in my life. After the interview aired on a moderately popular news channel, my family decided to reach out to me. I was surprised because, after all this time, I didn't expect them to come back into my life, especially not after they had distanced themselves so completely following my divorce. To my shock, just 3 days ago, they showed up at my office unannounced. When the receptionist informed me that my family was waiting outside, I initially thought it was my wife and son. It would have been odd since my wife was at work and my son was at school, but I was ready to embrace them. Then the receptionist clarified that it was my parents and sister who were there. Seeing them after so long was an overwhelming experience. I had so many mixed emotions: surprise, confusion, and even a hint of anger at their sudden reappearance after years of silence. I wasn't sure how to handle the situation, especially since they had chosen to come to my workplace, where I was in the middle of a busy day. It felt inappropriate for them to demand my time when I was focused on my business. I had built a new life for myself, and their unexpected visit stirred up a lot of old feelings and questions. What could they possibly want after all this time? It was then that I started finding it difficult to process what was going on. I told the receptionist to inform my family that I would see them later, but for now, they needed to leave. Of course, they didn't take that well and began throwing a tantrum. I didn't want security to throw them out before I had a chance to speak with them, so I reluctantly went to meet them in the lobby. As soon as they saw me, it was as if nothing had changed since the last time we were together, nearly 20 years ago. They started fawning over me, showering me with compliments about how great it was that I had become successful enough to make it onto the news. They described my story as inspiring, which felt surreal. After all this time, they were suddenly acting like they had always been supportive, even though they had distanced themselves when I needed them most. I tried to brush it off, insisting that I had to get back to work, but then they brought up my family. During my interview, I had shared a bit about my wife and son, highlighting how crucial they had been in my journey. I must admit, it felt strange to have them mention this part of my life. These were moments they hadn't been a part of, yet they were now eager to connect with it. They started expressing a desire to meet my wife and their grandson, claiming they had spent too long away from us. Hearing that made my heart race. Part of me was curious about what they wanted, but another part felt defensive. At that point, they started telling me that I hadn't put in enough effort to get in touch with them after the divorce and that I should have tried harder. This caught me off guard, but I realized that I might finally be able to get some clarity about what had happened back then. I decided to let them talk instead of dismissing them, even taking a seat in the lobby with them so I could get to the bottom of things and hopefully find some closure. As they spoke, I uncovered the real reason why Kathy had decided to divorce me and why my family had distanced themselves from me during that time. I know you might have figured it out already, but yes, Kathy had been cheating on me. I had never had a clue, and to my shock, my parents had been helping to cover it up all along. Now, I know that might seem harsh, but my parents had their reasons. At least, according to them, these were valid reasons to help their daughter-in-law cheat on their son. Apparently, the person Kathy was having an affair with was my cousin, my dad's brother's son. It was a devastating revelation that explained so much about the years of confusion and heartbreak I had experienced. My mind raced as I processed this information. All those times I had been left in the dark, grappling with feelings of betrayal and abandonment, were now being unraveled. My family's actions made a sickening kind of sense now, and I felt a mix of anger, sadness, and disbelief. How could they betray me like that? And how could Kathy, someone I thought I knew so well, have done this to me? It was hard to reconcile their claims of being supportive with the reality of their actions. When they finally told me all of that, everything seemed to fall into place almost immediately. It made sense why they had helped her, why I hadn't been invited to any family events for the past 20 years, and why I had been completely cast aside for no fault of my own. My cousin, let's call him Carl, was a spoiled, entitled brat, and I had always disliked him. Unfortunately, because his mother had passed away when he was just 6 months old, my family seemed to think he deserved a free pass for everything he did. Throughout his life, Nobody had bothered to teach him how to behave, and he always got away with everything. It didn't help that my uncle was my dad's boss since he had started the family business and my dad had joined him later. After my marriage, when Carl decided he wanted to be with Kathy and she was on board with it too, my family felt they had no choice but to help them out. They couldn't risk my uncle's anger, and putting their relationship with me at risk was an easily justifiable sacrifice in their eyes. They explained that after the divorce, my uncle made it very clear that he didn't want anyone in the family to have any contact with me at all, including my parents and sister. It felt like a dagger to my heart, realizing that the people who were supposed to support me had chosen to protect someone who had hurt me deeply instead. I was left feeling completely betrayed, not just by Kathy, but by the family I had always thought would stand by me. Apparently, my family had tried to protest when Kathy first started pulling away from me, but then she announced that she was pregnant with my child. That was the turning point. They felt they had no choice but to cut ties with me if they ever wanted to have any relationship with their grandkid. It's hard to believe that I was never notified about Kathy's pregnancy when she filed for divorce. She had moved out long before it was finalized, so I had no clue that I had become a father long before my son was born. To add to the shock, I learned that I have a daughter who is almost 20 now, and she has never even known me. She thinks Carl is her real father. The enormity of this revelation was overwhelming. It felt surreal, like I was being told a story rather than receiving the reality of my life. I had spent years trying to understand the pain of my past, only to find out that my family had essentially cut me off in favor of having a relationship with their grandchild and, in their minds, maintaining job security. I felt a mix of anger and betrayal. They had made a cowardly choice, prioritizing their own comfort over standing by me during a tumultuous time in my life. All those years of silence, isolation, and questioning my worth, only to learn that it was all because they wanted to protect their own interests. They could have easily approached me with the truth and allowed me to deal with the situation, but instead, they chose to let fear of my dad's brother dictate their actions, as if he could do any real harm beyond firing my father from the business. Even in that case, my dad could have retaliated with a lawsuit. As for not telling me about Kathy's pregnancy and the fact that I have a daughter, I can't fathom any justification for that. For 20 years, they kept this secret and never spoke up until they discovered I was doing well in life. Suddenly, they were filled with remorse and wanted to make amends. Unfortunately for them, I saw right through their act. Once they finished telling me everything, I told them I needed them to leave because, at that moment, I couldn't find it in my heart to forgive them. I tried to remain civil since we were in the lobby of my workplace and I didn't want to cause a scene, but I couldn't expect them to behave similarly. When I expressed my desire for them to leave, they immediately started whining, insisting that I needed to consider where they were coming from and how difficult the situation had been for them as well. I told them I knew for a fact that they were reaching out to me now solely because I had found success and they wanted a piece of it. They vehemently denied it, with my sister even going so far as to claim that I owed my success to them. By that, she clearly meant that I had used the name they suggested for my restaurant back when it was just a dream. I found it incredibly bold for her to make such a claim, especially considering I hadn't received any of their support over the years. I had built everything on my own, with help from my friends, not them. Merely suggesting a name didn't give them the right to take credit for my achievements, and it was such a ridiculous notion that I ended up laughing at her. I told her that if she and my parents didn't leave immediately, I would have them forcibly removed from the building. They immediately started arguing, insisting they weren't going anywhere until we cleared the air. But honestly, I wasn't interested in that. So I followed through with my threat and had them thrown out by security. They were naturally upset during the ejection, trying to tell me they had no choice in this matter, but I didn't buy it. They definitely had a choice. They just made the wrong one, and now they have to face the consequences. It hasn't been difficult for them to go without seeing me and my family for the past 20 years, so I'm sure they can manage the future just fine as well. Anyway, it's been 3 days since that confrontation, and they haven't stopped trying to reach me. They've been texting me on social media, sending emails to my work address, and even showing up at my office, though they haven't had the nerve to come inside again. There's been a noticeable shift in their attitude. Now, all their messages are filled with apologies. Even when I see them waiting outside my workplace, they look genuinely upset and hopeful for a chance to talk, but I just drive by and ignore them. To be honest, it's reached a point where I almost feel a bit sorry for them. I've discussed this with my wife because, regardless of what I decide to do about my family, we still need to think about my daughter, whom I didn't even know existed until a few days ago. We've been going back and forth on whether we should try to trace my daughter and reach out to her. On top of that, my family hasn't given up. I doubt they'll go anywhere until they get another chance to speak with me. My wife thinks it might be worth it to invite them over and try to clear the air. She believes that addressing the toxicity could be beneficial for my emotional health. However, I have no interest in doing anything like that. I just want to continue ignoring them until they go away on their own. I simply don't have the capacity to deal with them right now, especially with everything I've recently learned. So, we're struggling to figure out how to handle this situation. I want to ask if it's unreasonable for me not to want to give my parents a chance to speak to me after 20 years of no contact. It's been a week and 3 days since I posted, and my wife and I have decided to continue ignoring my family. Thankfully, they haven't shown up at my workplace for the past couple of days. Maybe they've finally gotten tired of it or felt intimidated by security, but whatever the reason, I'm relieved. Once they stopped showing up, it became much easier for me to stop thinking about them. I guess it was just their presence that was making me feel guilty about my choices. However, I no longer feel guilty about ignoring their messages. They can keep apologizing all they want, but it won't change anything. The truth is, they failed me as a family, and no amount of apologies can make that right again. They continue to send messages from various accounts and email addresses, but I'm not even bothering to block them anymore. What's the point? They'll just create new ones to try to reach out to me, and I'll keep ignoring it all. Let's see how long they can keep this up and how sincere their apologies really are. Now, on to the other issue my wife and I are dealing with, our daughter. We have her full name and know where she goes to college since my parents mentioned it during our conversation. My assistant even managed to find her social media accounts for me, but so far, I haven't taken any action. I'm unsure whether it's appropriate to reach out or how to tell her that I'm her biological father. The whole situation feels overwhelming, and I want to approach it the right way. Since she's not a minor, I can't just show up at Kathy's house demanding custody or anything like that. Honestly, I'd prefer to keep her out of this mess entirely, especially after everything I've discovered about Kathy and my family. I've lost all respect for them. They're just a bunch of spineless cowards. However, I can't say the same about my daughter. No matter who raised her, she's still my flesh and blood. So finally, my wife and I decided to go for it. There was no point in waiting for the perfect moment to reach out to my daughter. We just needed to rip off the Band-Aid. Since she lives in a different state, we figured it wouldn't be right to fly out to her. So we decided to send her a message first and see how she responds. We reached out to her on Instagram and explained everything as gently as we could. Now, we're just waiting for her reply. I'm sure it's going to be really complicated to come to terms with everything. It's complicated for me as well, and I can't even grasp how my wife has managed to be so supportive while I reach out to the daughter I never knew I had with my ex-wife. I'm certain there are a lot of mixed emotions for all of us, but we're doing our best. I genuinely hope my daughter responds because I would love to build a relationship with her. As for my parents, they haven't shown up at my workplace in a while. Yesterday, they sent me a lengthy email expressing their remorse about everything and their genuine desire to repair our relationship. They asked for one chance and mentioned they wouldn't reach out again. Instead, they'd wait for me to contact them. Honestly, I'm relieved they've taken the hint and realized that I'm not ready to speak with them right now. I have enough on my plate already, and the last thing I need is for them to stir up more drama. I'm just hoping they stick to what they said and don't reach out to me again. If I feel ready or want to speak with them at any point, I'll do so myself. However, right now, it seems very unlikely that will happen anytime soon. Knowing the real reason they hadn't spoken to me in 20 years has made things much worse. I feel betrayed and hurt, and I doubt those feelings will fade anytime soon. At least one good thing came from this. I discovered I have a daughter, and I really hope she decides to give our relationship a chance. I haven't told my son yet, just in case she doesn't want to talk to us. I wouldn't want to give him false hope. But if things go well, he might find a sister in her, and I could get to know the daughter I never knew I had. I'm just overwhelmed with emotions right now, trying hard to keep it all together. So almost 2 weeks ago, I reached out to my daughter on social media and sent her a message explaining everything about who I am and how we're related. After waiting for 2 weeks, I finally got a text back today. She didn't say much, just that she spoke to her mother about me after my message and found out that I'm her biological father. Obviously, this must have come as a shock to her because for the past 20 years, she believed that Carl was her biological father and had no idea she wasn't his daughter. She also learned the real story about how her mother and I ended up in this situation, and she told me that she would like to meet me and my family. So, we're all flying out to see her this weekend since she isn't speaking to her family right now and doesn't have the funds to come see us. She didn't go into detail, but when she confronted Kathy about my message, Kathy initially tried to deny it. Eventually, she was forced to tell her the truth. I haven't heard from Kathy yet, and I really hope she doesn't contact me because I don't want to speak to her. Unfortunately, My family broke their promise immediately and started trying to talk to me as soon as they learned I had reached out to my daughter. Apparently, my uncle was furious that I found out about the situation. Naturally, he has reason to be upset since they spent 20 years trying to ensure I never discovered the truth, fearing I would cause trouble in their lives. Now that I finally know, my uncle is holding my parents accountable for everything. To complicate matters, my dad no longer works for my uncle, as he is now independent, yet he seems terrified of his older brother. He has been begging me to tell my uncle or Carl, or anyone else, that they had nothing to do with this and that I discovered the truth on my own. Somehow, even if I did tell my family that I found out on my own, I think it's highly unlikely anyone would believe it. They're the only ones who would do something like this, and since I haven't been close to most of my family and they haven't bothered to speak to me in the past 20 years, it's funny how desperate they're acting right now just to maintain their relationship with my uncle. But honestly, I don't really care. It was because of them that I didn't have a relationship with my daughter for 20 years, so I think this is really the least they can do. My family and I finally met my daughter. It was weird at first, then really emotional, but mostly it was just beautiful. She seems to be a genuinely kind and good person, which is surprising considering she was raised by two of the cruelest and most horrible people I know. But I guess they did a decent job raising her, or maybe it's just her own innate nature. Regardless, she seems to be really intelligent and mature. We had a long chat about how things were going with Kathy and her father. She told me that, naturally, they weren't on board with her meeting us, but she didn't care. After finding out the truth, she realized she simply didn't care what her parents thought. They haven't had any other children after her, so she doesn't think she'll abandon them forever, but she's definitely planning to distance herself from them for a while to process everything. She mentioned that she needs some time to start building a relationship with me as well, and I completely understand where she's coming from. Overall, we had a really nice time together, and she seemed to get along well with my wife and her half-brother. We had dinner, during which she revealed that my parents, her grandparents, had been in touch with her all along. She always found it strange how emotional they were about her, considering they weren't her actual grandparents. Now it all makes sense why they were so attached to her. However, after everything she's discovered, she sees all of them in a different light, and so do I. I can completely understand how she feels. Well, maybe not entirely since I'm much older, and she's just 20, but I can't imagine it's a lot harder for her. She's been lied to her entire life by the people she thought were the closest to her, and that must be incredibly difficult to reconcile. Both of us are going to have to work on this, and I'm hopeful that the future will be better. I know it has to be because we're committed to making it the best it can be. What truly brings me joy is that the meeting went well, and my family seems to be content with everything that has happened, as do I. I feel quite at peace with the situation, regardless of what my family or Kathy and Carl have done. What matters most is that after so many years, we finally have a chance to make things right, and I'm determined to make the most of that opportunity. As I left work that evening, a strange sense of peace washed over me. I had just met my daughter, and we had begun to bridge the chasm created by years of lies. But that calm was shattered when I spotted my uncle and Carl waiting for me in the parking lot, their faces twisted in anger. "What do you think you're doing, playing family with her?" My uncle spat, venom dripping from his words. "You're nothing to her, just a biological accident." Carl stepped forward, fists clenched and ready to fight. "You don't get to waltz back into her life after all these years. Stay away from her, or you'll regret it." I could feel the rage bubbling up inside me. "You think you can intimidate me? You've already destroyed enough lives. I'm not afraid of you." In a heartbeat, the confrontation escalated. I lunged at Carl, throwing a punch that connected hard with his jaw, sending him staggering back. My uncle charged me, but I sidestepped and delivered a swift kick that sent him crashing into a parked car. What followed was a brutal exchange. I fought like a man possessed, driven by years of pent-up frustration. Each punch I landed was a release, a cathartic explosion of anger and hurt. I could see the shock on their faces as I unleashed everything I had. In mere moments, they were on the ground, gasping for breath. The sight of them, bruised and defeated, felt like justice for all the years of betrayal they had inflicted upon me. I stood over them, my chest heaving with adrenaline. "Consider this a warning," I said, my voice low and steady. "Stay out of my life, and stay away from my daughter. She deserves better than the lies you've fed her." Just as the weight of my anger began to lift, I heard sirens approaching. I turned to see the police arriving, summoned by onlookers who witnessed the scene. I stood there, still buzzing from the fight, as they handcuffed my uncle and Carl, their faces a mix of humiliation and fury. They were charged with trespassing and criminal intimidation, their their threats now a joke? I took a deep breath and pulled out my phone to call my parents. I knew I needed to make my boundaries clear. Stay away from me and my family. You've done enough damage. I'm cutting ties with all of you. This is the last time I'll ask. I hung up feeling a strange mix of relief and finality. I wouldn't let them hurt me any longer. Meanwhile, my daughter was making her own choices. After hearing the full story of the deception and manipulation from her adoptive family, she decided to cut ties with them, too. I don't need them in my life anymore, she told me, her voice steady and resolute. They lied to me for so long. I want to start fresh with you and your family. In that moment, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I had fought for something real and meaningful, and now we had a chance to build a future together, free from the shadows of betrayal. Together, we would forge a new path, and this time, we wouldn't look back. Dear listeners, please share your thoughts in the comments section below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
Dear Jeff, as I sit down to put my thoughts into words, I can't help but feel a mix of emotions swirling within me. Leaving you wasn't an easy decision, and I hope you understand that it's not about blame or resentment. It's about acknowledging the changes that have occurred within me, and recognizing that I owe it to both of us to address them honestly. Our journey together has been filled with moments of joy, laughter, and shared experiences that I will always treasure. From the early days of our relationship to building a life together, we've weathered storms and celebrated triumphs side by side. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of myself amidst the familiarity of our routine. I want you to know that this decision isn't a reflection of your worth or our love for each other. It's about me needing to rediscover who I am outside of our relationship. I've spent so long defining myself in relation to you that I've neglected my own dreams and desires. Leaving you this letter is my way of being honest with both of us. I couldn't bear to see the hurt in your eyes or hear the pain in your voice as I try to explain these feelings. It's not fair to either of us to prolong the inevitable, and I hope you can find it in your heart to understand. I wish you nothing but happiness and fulfillment in the days ahead. You deserve someone who can love you wholeheartedly, without reservation or hesitation. And I hope that someday we can look back on our time together with fondness, grateful for the lessons learned and the memories shared. Take care of yourself, Jeff. You'll always hold a special place in my heart. I realize that what I'm about to say might come across as hypocritical and selfish, but the truth is, it is selfish, and that's why I've made the decision to leave. I crave the excitement of pursuing someone new, the thrill of a fresh romance, and unfortunately, you can't provide that anymore. When we were younger, you were irresistible, playing guitar with Buddy in the band, riding your Harley in that hot leather jacket, your blonde hair flowing in the wind as you swept me off my feet on the dance floor, whether it was at a rock and roll club or in a ballroom. You created beautiful paintings of me and the kids. But over time, we became complacent in our relationship. The gigs with the band faded as you took on coaching soccer. The Harley now sits idle in the garage beneath the kids' sports gear in front of the minivan, and my knees can't keep up on the dance floor anymore. Though you still have that beautiful hair. Now that the kids are grown, I no longer feel comfortable with the minivan lifestyle that you seem to have embraced. I want to assure you that I haven't cheated on you, and you remain the only man I've ever been romantic with. However, I have found myself drawn to other men. Before I considered any further actions, I felt it was necessary to end things with you. I couldn't bear the idea of betraying your trust by sneaking around behind your back. Jeff, I've always loved you too much for that. I'm certain our paths will cross again, but I have no desire to discuss this matter with you. I've already spoken with Sam and asked him to handle our divorce proceedings. He's prepared the necessary paperwork, leaving you with everything except my clothing and personal belongings, which I've already taken. I've also agreed to split my pension with you and take on half of our debts, excluding the mortgage. It's only fair, after all, I played a role in incurring those debts, and I want to ensure fairness. Please grieve in private so that when we attend events for the kids, we can avoid any unnecessary drama. However, I believe in fairness, so if you feel the need to respond, I promise to read your letter carefully and respect your thoughts. With love, Ellen.
I pored over the note repeatedly, rooted to the spot in the kitchen where I found it. Tears hadn't come. Not yet. I was too numb. There were no signs of this impending revelation, no expression of dissatisfaction, no indication of desires unmet, no arguments, and no hints of another man in her life. We shared touches, kisses, smiles, all the gestures of a couple planning a future together. In fact, I had spent the past year wooing her, attempting to reignite our passion now that our youngest had left for college. I bought jewelry, only to be scolded for its expense. She preferred chocolate. I relinquished control of our closeness, believing I was causing her stress by initiating lovemaking. She insisted that holding hands sufficed. Perhaps she did drop a hint, but I brushed it off, attributing it to her adjusting to middle age. So there I stood, the last to realize. I grabbed a beer and stepped into the shower simultaneously. After finishing one, I reached for two more and returned to the shower, leaving behind a trail of water on her floors without fear of reprimand. I drank with determination to exhaust my stash, although like wine enthusiasts cellar their wines, I stored fine beers. While I didn't dent my beer collection, if I had, I'd have turned to my wines. However, I did make a significant impact on my consciousness. The next morning, I awoke with a throbbing headache, lying undressed on the basement floor after the shower. I stumbled upstairs, purged everything I'd consumed, crawled into bed, and wept. When I was 11, my grandmother passed away. During her wake and funeral, Grandpa took me aside and imparted wisdom. You have 3 days to mourn a loss. As God resurrected the dead in 3 days, you can resurrect your life. Cry, scream, vent your frustrations. When you're old enough, have a drink, engage in a good brawl, pray. Allow yourself these actions, then move forward. Honor the departed by progressing. A man doesn't dwell on a past he's lost. He lives in the present he's shaping and the future he's moving toward. Grandpa's words resonated deeply. I viewed my wife's departure as the end of our marriage. I wept, drank to excess, battered sheetrock walls with my bleeding fists, and used furniture to release my anguish. I yelled, I kicked, I drank. I scarcely ate, justifying that beer consists of grain, yeast, and water, akin to bread, and wine is derived from fruit. There, my food groups condensed into 2 bottles. I was on summer break when she chose to leave, waiting until the day after the school year ended. It was a well-timed decision. But by the following Tuesday, I emerged from my mourning. The first thing I did was call my kids. Ellen had already informed them of her choice, and they had desperately tried to reach me. I was too intoxicated to pick up, but I reassured them I was all right. Then I set about tidying up the house and arranged for my favorite charity to collect a truckload of donations. I had no intention of holding on to the remnants of a failed marriage. I kept only the family heirloom furniture, boxing up photos and albums for the kids. Everything else was treated the same way, with the ridiculous knickknacks meeting their end in the trash. What did I care about Spanish pottery or brass cats from Portugal? Over the next couple of days, I made trips to Home Depot, stocking up on flooring, carpet, paint, and new sheetrock. My aim was to transform the house into my own space. The pink and coral walls and frilly curtains were a thing of the past. I also visited Sam's and completed the divorce paperwork. Since it was uncontested with only one lawyer involved, he said it would likely be finalized around the time school resumed. I sold the minivan and traded it in for a '76 Triumph Spitfire convertible, just as I had always dreamed. It was British racing green with beige leather upholstery and chromed wire wheels. After clearing out the garage of unused clutter, unpacking the Harley was a breeze. Yet, the most significant decision I made was reaching out to Buddy. That call altered my life as swiftly as my wife's departure letter had just days before. Within half an hour of sharing my news with him, Buddy and the gang were at my doorstep. Buddy had been my closest friend since 3rd grade. We formed our band together, played sports together, took the same classes, and even double-dated. He had been my best man, and I was his. The collapse of my marriage was a profound blow to him, and he wouldn't allow me to navigate the upheaval of my domestic life alone. Our band had disbanded years ago due to life's demands, but our loyal supporters hadn't forgotten us. When I mentioned Buddy and the boys, it's more than just a handful of guys. We'd played at countless weddings, funerals, parties, and picnics, often offering our services at a discounted rate or for free because we cherished the community that followed us from gig to gig. Good deeds tend to breed more good deeds, and when news spread that I was overhauling my place to make it truly my own, the floodgates of generosity opened wide. Over the next fortnight, painters, carpenters, masons, plumbers, every imaginable tradesman pitched in to fix up much more than just my walls. Within a month, my house had undergone a complete transformation, both inside and out. There's something about a group of guys that attracts a crowd of girls. Their wives and girlfriends began dropping by Project Jeff's house to oversee the renovations, and soon they were bringing along their single friends for what we humorously dubbed Project Jeff's love life. No one was pushy in their matchmaking efforts. It was still too early for that. But it was evident that seeds were being planted, and before long I found myself out dancing and socializing 2 to 3 nights a week. Spontaneous barbecues and gatherings sprang up at my place, and I was never short of company, although I wasn't quite ready to dive into a new relationship before finalizing my divorce. Buddy floated the idea of resurrecting the band. In fact, he had already lined up gigs at clubs where we had old connections. Even before the fresh paint had dried on my walls, Buddy and Jeff made a triumphant return, headlining Friday nights at Jimmy's and commanding Saturdays at a cozy dance club downtown. He even booked us as a duo for Sunday afternoons at a popular seafood joint by the waterfront. It was as if we had never stopped playing together. We were all at similar stages in our lives, with our kids either grown or independent. We all looked pretty sharp and still had our own hair, well, except for Ronnie, our drummer. We hit the ground running. Our loyal fan base emerged from hibernation, eagerly paying their covers to pack the venues every single night. Whenever my sons had the chance, they'd drop by to lend a hand with the renovations, occasionally even joining in with the band. I ensured they understood not to disclose anything to their mom about me and to be truthful if she asked. They conveyed that Dad had been upset initially, but has since moved forward and is doing well. My daughter, living in Australia with her fiancé, received similar instructions. I trusted my kids implicitly to honor my wishes, and I knew they were being honest when they assured me that Ellen was kept in the dark about my well-being. To combat loneliness, I focused on cultivating healthy habits, revamping my diet, and ramping up my exercise regimen. I'd never let myself go out of shape, but now I attacked the pool with gusto and hit the road, whether running or biking, with renewed determination. Every evening before heading off to a gig, I'd hit the weights, alternating between leg days and upper body workouts. Within a month of Ellen's departure, I had rebuilt my home, my social circle, my daily schedule, my relationship with my children, and my physique. It seemed only fitting to respond to her letter. After all, she had initiated the conversation, hadn't she? Dear Ellen, thank you. You were right. Goodbye. Jeff. I sent the email to her. Short and to the point, it conveyed everything I needed it to. I didn't bother seeking out her new address, and truth be told, I didn't really want it. Rumors floated around about her, whispers of her involvement with a younger man who drove a flashy car and had a silver tongue. They'd been spotted together at shore clubs and beaches. Whenever someone tried to fill me in on her life, I politely declined to listen. But among our shared friends, these snippets pieced together a narrative of a whirlwind romance that spanned from September to June, or perhaps October to June, or even November to May. But none of it mattered to me. I genuinely wished her well. Grandpa's 3-day rule had guided me through, and I was content with the person I had become, too enamored with my present self to dwell on the past, us. The end of summer marked a melancholy reality for teachers like me, but August was ablaze with musical opportunities. This year was no different. Buddy and I found ourselves booked for festival after festival straight through September. Labor Day saw us performing 2 to 3 times a day. The hectic schedule kept me from checking her emailed response. It wasn't a deliberate snub. I simply thought our exchange was meant to be brief, a way to tie up loose ends, just as she wanted. I was too engrossed in the whirlwind of events and having too much fun to bother with email. In fact, I had almost forgotten about my marital woes when Sam called with news that our divorce out impromptu tunes, getting the crowd fired up and dancing. It felt exhilarating. The guys had rummaged through our archives and unearthed our old masters from back in the day. We never got around to recording an album before life got in the way. But now we had enough material to fill a couple of makeshift albums. CDs were much easier to produce than vinyl, and we compiled a mix of old and new tracks that flew off the sales table. I was receiving looks from women of all ages, signaling that I was more than ready to end my dry spell. Amidst the chaos, I didn't notice Ellen attempting to sneak backstage, as I slung my guitar onto the back bar of my bike, which I had modified years ago for guitar transport. I missed her rushing toward me. I also missed the moment her face fell upon seeing another woman, Michelle, a busty blonde in her 30s, swinging her leg to sit behind me. It was the first time in the entire 25-year life of my bike that someone else had occupied that seat. I didn't see a tear form in Ellen's eye as I drove away from her. I wish I had. Michelle was incredible. I won't delve into explicit details of our encounter or the intensity of our physical connection. You can find that in another story. Let's just say, I pursued her relentlessly throughout the night, rebounding like a teenager and reaching heights of satisfaction I hadn't experienced in ages. I completely wore her out. By the end of the night, she thanked me for our time together, but suggested I not call her again, perhaps wary of the recovery time needed after our escapade. I knew I couldn't avoid Ellen forever, and I didn't. The next time I saw her was at our regular Friday night gig at Jimmy's. She walked in with her new companion and another couple, and they found a table and ordered drinks. As soon as I spotted her, I signaled to the band that we were deviating from our prepared set list. We had a tradition of playing American Woman whenever we spotted an ex-girlfriend in the crowd, and it was always the wronged guy who took the mic. It was our way of standing in solidarity with our friend. We firmly believed that dating an ex of one of us was off limits, and we never crossed that line. As I began playing the guitar riff in the slower, soulful style that Lenny Kravitz had popularized with his cover of the tune, I found myself enjoying American Woman more than ever before. Pouring my heart and soul into the lyrics, the guitar solos resonated with the crowd, igniting their energy. Unaware of Ellen's reaction, I didn't witness the moment her face fell upon realizing the song was directed at her, but Buddy's wife observed it. Later, she recounted how tears welled in Ellen's eyes as I sang lines like "Stay away from me" and "Go on and let me be," with emotions flowing freely. Ellen left before the song ended, barely maintaining her composure. Meanwhile, her companion and friends stayed behind, continuing to drink and dance into the night. It was evident that trouble was brewing in paradise. A week later, my older son paid me a visit with some intriguing news. It seemed Ellen and her boy toy had a falling out that same night. He was growing weary of her charms, while she struggled to keep up with the energetic lifestyle, both carnally and otherwise, of a man in his 20s. He voiced frustration over Ellen avoiding venues where we performed. Word had spread that the band was back in action, drawing crowds wherever we played. Additionally, he was displeased to learn that Ellen had relinquished her rights to our property in the divorce and had been planning to move into my house. I had suspected him of gold digging, but his audacity was staggering. Perhaps he was unaware of our prenuptial agreement, a precautionary measure devised by Ellen's father, who harbored suspicions about any man's intentions toward his daughter. I had readily agreed to it, as I had no intention of causing her injury. The agreement stipulated that if either of us left the marriage for greener pastures, we forfeited all rights to the family assets, leaving them entirely to the other party. It was likely Ellen remembered this agreement, which might explain why she proposed such an amicable divorce settlement. After Boy Toy sent her packing, Ellen spent the following night in tears, pouring her heart out to the kids over the phone. I sympathized with her plight, but I had already gone through my 3 days of mourning for my marriage and was now free to offer support without being emotionally entangled. However, the kids weren't pleased with my detached attitude. They still saw me as unattached and believed I should welcome their mom back into the family home, at least temporarily, to help her get back on her feet. But I disagreed. Taking her in would mean dealing with the inevitable mood swings that came with menopause, a challenge I had already experienced during our marriage. Adding to that her feelings of rejection by Boy Toy, the humiliation of crawling back to me, and potential guilt over leaving me in the first place was not something I was eager to handle on a daily basis. I was enjoying my newfound simplicity and independence too much to disrupt it. As days turned into weeks, the kids toned down their insistence to a more reasonable request for assistance, and I obliged by allowing them access to the storage unit I had rented for our furniture and belongings, which were too valuable to discard, until Ellen found a small apartment of her own. I even lent them the band's truck to help with the move. With the new school year in full swing and a busy schedule for the band, I rarely crossed paths with Ellen. Although we both taught in the same district, we worked in different school buildings, so our encounters were infrequent, and when they did happen, I barely took notice of her. I had become a popular topic of discussion in the rumor mill, perhaps due to the frequent appearances of my Harley or sports car, or maybe it was my increased activity level spilling over into school life, or simply my newfound status as an eligible bachelor. But rumors held little significance for me. The band was thriving, my barbecue parties were legendary for their good times, and I never lacked female companionship. Content as could be, I found myself not missing married life in the slightest. Flying to France for Thanksgiving was a long-held dream of mine, coinciding with the release of Beaujolais Nouveau, and this year, Thanksgiving fell early enough for the calendar to align perfectly. As I packed my bags, I was taken aback when my son called the night before I left, inviting me to a Thanksgiving dinner at Ellen's. He seemed genuinely upset when I explained I already had plans, but he quickly pivoted to suggesting that we host a family Christmas instead. He and his girlfriend offered to handle the cooking, with the condition that I provide the venue. He mentioned that all 3 kids would be coming into town and expressed their desire for a special day to reminisce. I agreed to the Christmas gathering on the condition that Ellen understood she wasn't welcome to bring a date and that I would dedicate my attention to the kids. I was surprised to learn from my son that Ellen wasn't dating at all and was actually quite lonely. Despite this revelation, I didn't delve further into her love life. My primary concern was ensuring a harmonious family gathering, without any awkwardness caused by a new romantic interest. I extended the invitation for them to stay at my home for as long as they wished, preferring that all the kids stay together rather than in a hotel. However, my son expressed concern that Ellen might feel uncomfortable leaving while everyone else stayed on. After mulling over his words, I realized that this reunion would be the first time our family could all be together since the kids moved out. I acknowledged that Ellen belonged there too. So, invite her to stay as well, I told my son. But she'll have to accept sleeping in the guest room, as I don't think it would be wise for her to stay in her old room. If you bring guests, they'll need to share your room or find accommodations elsewhere. Thanks, Dad. This means a lot to all of us, my son replied gratefully. Christmas that year fell on a Saturday, and the festivities began on Thursday night as everyone arrived. My daughter and her fiancé flew in from Australia, while my son and his girlfriend drove in from Boston, picking up my youngest who was in college there. Ellen arrived about 10 minutes before them, and I observed her sitting in her car, seemingly nervous. Witnessing them all gather in the front yard, hugging and kissing, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of sentimentality for the first time since emerging from my 3 days of mourning. As the 6 of them entered through the front door, they were met with a warm and welcoming atmosphere. It occurred to me that neither my daughter nor my ex-wife had set foot in the house since I remodeled it, so there was an element of surprise in their homecoming. Yet, I had adorned the house with Christmas decorations, much in the same fashion as we had done for years. Candles, nutcrackers, and centerpieces adorned the space, albeit now on my new furniture. The Christmas tree, adorned with old ornaments collected from vacations and handmade ones from the kids' art classes, stood proudly in its customary place. I had added a fireplace during the renovations, and its warm glow added to the festive ambience. The aroma of pine, crackling fire, and mulled cider enveloped the room. Plates of cookies and fudge dotted every available surface, and the table was set with the fine china that had been passed down from Ellen's grandmother as our wedding gift many years ago. It was evident that I had transformed our house into my home, and it was more than ready to host Christmas for my family. Despite everything that had transpired, they were undeniably my family. The kids, though grown, were still my flesh and blood, and despite our divorce, Ellen had held the key to my heart for most of my adult life. There was a flurry of excitement as they explored the house. I had restored the kids' bedrooms to almost exactly how they remembered, with minor updates such as toning down the hot pink in my daughter's room to a softer pastel shade. I had replaced their old single beds with comfortable queen sets, while preserving their childhood desk and dresser sets with new headboards to match. The spacious guest room had been converted into a studio, complete with a drafting table by the window for painting and ample space for musical instruments, amps, and recording gear. I'd also expanded one side of the ground floor, transforming a small library into a large room with a TV and pool table. The living room had been meticulously arranged around the new fireplace, now adorned with brand new Christmas stockings, one for each of us, including Ellen. The sight of the stockings sparked an instant rush of nostalgia in the kids. With mischievous grins, they darted towards their stockings, and in that moment, it was as if time itself reversed, and they became carefree children again, eagerly diving into the holiday spirit. The older two, with a touch of maturity, retrieved their partner's stockings as well, each recounting cherished memories the stockings evoked. Our tradition had always been to lovingly fill the stockings with small, inexpensive gifts and treats before moving on to the main presents under the tree. Soon, the air was filled with the sound of laughter and the rustling of wrappers as they nibbled on cookies and chocolates. donned silly novelty socks, and reveled in the joy of Christmas morning. "Dad, your stocking is empty. We didn't know, so we didn't bring anything to stuff it," they exclaimed. Taking my stocking from the mantel, I peered inside. "No, my dear, you did fill it. You're all here reminiscing, laughing, and playing. You're filling it now with the essence of Christmas. You're filling it with love." With hugs and kisses exchanged, we wished each other Merry Christmas. Ellen lingered in our embrace a bit longer than expected, but it felt natural, and for a moment it was as if we were still one big happy family. As the kids realized there were probably presents under the tree, the excitement of childhood Christmases flooded back. Gifts were exchanged, the feast was enjoyed, and after the dishes were cleared, the guitars came out for our customary Christmas jam session. As the night grew late, we began to retire to our respective sleeping quarters. Ellen moved towards the hall closet to retrieve her coat. "Thank you for being so kind to me today. I really appreciate spending Christmas Day with you and the kids. I know I have myself to blame, but of all the things I gave up, I miss the family time the most. Well, the kids are all grown and on their own now. This gathering would be just as rare even if we were still together," I responded, acknowledging the bittersweet reality of our situation. "I understand, but I also miss the quality time we used to share as just the two of us. You know, the time when it was just us as a couple. I suppose I'm finally apologizing to you. I really messed up what could have been a great life for both of us. Don't be so hard on yourself. We always encouraged our kids to pursue their dreams, to find happiness, and you did just that. We still have fulfilling lives. They're just different now." She gave me a disbelieving look. "So you're telling me you don't value what we had? After today, you don't feel any nostalgia? Regret for what we've lost?" "Ellen, we had today, and it was wonderful. What exactly do you think we've lost?" "We lost each other. I lost you. And I'll never forgive myself for it. And it seems like you couldn't care less." Tears streamed down her face. I wrapped my arm around her, and she broke down completely. I had already shed my tears when she first arrived, but I felt a pang of sadness seeing her like this on Christmas Day. Once she calmed down, I reminded her of our college days when she had ended things with me. She had been worried that things were getting too serious too quickly, and needed time to decide if she truly wanted a lifelong commitment to one person. I recounted how hurt I had been when she left, but that I couldn't bear to be with someone who wasn't fully committed to me. I explained how I had given myself a mourning period after our marriage ended and had emerged ready to embrace life again. Today, she was a beautiful part of my life, and for that, I was grateful. I remained composed, which helped calm her tears. I asked her to spend the night, set up the studio bed, and provided her with one of my t-shirts and a robe. Returning upstairs after securing the house, I heard her crying, doubting she would sleep. Nonetheless, I slept soundly. The following day felt like an extension of Christmas, and Ellen was delighted when we urged her to stay the entire weekend. We avoided discussing our past while the kids were around, but I noticed familiar expressions from our marriage in Ellen's eyes. There were the "I love you so much" and "you're wonderful" smiles. I even responded to a few silent requests for hugs and kisses. We seemed to understand each other as we did when we were married. At meals, she poured her coffee and I added just the right amount of milk. I buttered my pancakes and she applied the perfect amount of maple syrup. We completed each other's sentences. However, we slept in separate rooms. After the children departed together, leaving my daughter to visit Boston with the boys and then head to Vermont for skiing, Ellen and I were alone in our jointly owned home. I tended to the fire while she opened a bottle of wine. We sat and conversed, reminiscing, joking, and eventually delving into serious matters. "I acted foolishly, wrongly, and cruelly. I understand I can never fully make amends, and I don't expect your forgiveness, but I do want to apologize. I hope we can at least be friends again. You weren't just my husband. You were my best friend, my confidant, my most trusted ally, my partner in mischief, and I miss every part of you dearly." I smiled at her, and the floodgates opened. Ellen spoke eloquently, recounting how she fell into boredom, realizing now that she had pushed me away to create the passionless void we both endured. She described the excitement of meeting a flattering younger man and the temptation of a clandestine affair. She admitted to demonizing me to justify her actions, portraying me as the villain when she was the one behaving monstrously. Her narrative oscillated between the thrill of betrayal and anger that I didn't fight for her, that I seemed indifferent and allowed her to slip away. She confessed to feeling jealous of my life when I bounced back and resumed the lifestyle I enjoyed before we met, especially when she saw another woman riding on the back of my Harley. Her jealousy turned to rage as she witnessed me with different women, each offering something she perceived as superior to what she had given me. Her emotional state plummeted after the divorce was finalized, discovering that her younger lover had a pattern of dating married women until they were single, then discarding them. It seemed he enjoyed spending their husband's money ever since his father, a traditionalist who strongly disapproved of his son's affair-breaking habits, disowned him and cut him off from his trust funds. She struggled to find another prospect after the breakup. It appeared that the eligible men her age were either already taken or unwilling to commit to a woman who had cheated on her loyal first husband. While there were plenty of men willing to buy her drinks, dance with her, or spend the night, there were no lasting options. Younger men were content to date her. After all, she maintained her attractiveness and allure when she chose to engage. However, they weren't interested in a long-term relationship with someone going through menopause. Starting a family under those circumstances posed a challenge. I listened to her vent until she ran out of steam. I poured us both another glass of wine and handed hers to her with a smile. Well, from what you've told me, I suppose you made some pretty foolish choices. But you don't owe me anything. As I mentioned before, you pursued your desires, and I loved you enough to let you go. I wished I could have captured her expression at that moment. It was clear she hadn't anticipated my response being tied to my love for her. I forgave you almost immediately. How could I hold you in a marriage when you wanted out? I couldn't keep you confined or restricted. If I had forbidden something, you would have simply hidden it from me and proceeded anyway. Though your note may have seemed harsh initially, looking back, it streamlined things for us. We avoided property disputes and didn't have to worry about custody since our children were grown. I should thank you for that. So I'm no longer your husband, and it may take some time before you consider me a best friend or advisor. Trust is certainly an issue for me, but if you're willing to trust my advice, that label is yours to decide. Partners in crime might be a bit too romantic for where we are now, but how about we just call ourselves friends? Tears welled up in her eyes as she melted into my embrace. She decided to stay another night, but no, let's not go there. We slept separately. We simply had a lot to catch up on. It seemed we were comfortable sharing the parenting role again. The following day, she went home to prepare for a New Year's trip to join the kids in Boston. I had gigs lined up all week. It's a highly lucrative time for musicians. The added benefit was that my focus was on my music, and Ellen hardly crossed my mind. With the start of the new school term after New Year's, my schedule left little room to see Ellen. Our paths crossed next at an in-service conference in April. We ended up sitting beside each other and found ourselves sharing a table for lunch. We had a delightful conversation, centered around my daughter's upcoming marriage in Australia. It seemed we were reverting to our roles as friends. Towards the end of the lunch, she thanked me for treating her well, both that day and at Christmas. She expressed happiness that we could move forward as friends, and then asked me for a favor. She blushed, hesitated a bit, and finally stammered out a request to go for a ride on the Harley one Saturday. I responded eagerly, affirming that Sunday was forecasted to be warm and beautiful with no prior commitments. I suggested we take a ride up north, stop for a pleasant lunch, and relish some time in the fresh air. She was cheerful and animated. Memories of her on the bike with me when we were younger flooded back. Those days always ended with passionate moments inspired by hours of her holding on to me from behind as we rode, her hands exploring my chest and, well, you can imagine without further detail. She always joked about the next time we'd go for a ride with something powerful between her legs, and the motorcycle was nice too. I wasn't sure if I could resist her. And I was right. I couldn't. We rode up to the falls, and I felt her hands wander. We hiked to the top of the falls and followed the long trail through the woods back down to the bike. We stopped in a quaint little town and wandered the streets, browsing antique shops. It was the type of day I typically detested, but spending time with this woman, who I had always seen as beautiful in every way, made it enjoyable. Lunch was delightful. By dinner time, we had returned south and stopped at a charming seafood dock for dinner. With candlelight, delicious food, and the gentle lapping of waves at the dock, it was evident she was being treated to a special evening. I took her home, to my home, our home. I took her to bed, our bed, my bed. Yes, we made love this time. It seemed we were now sharing the role of lovers together. We continued seeing each other for dinner and a movie the following week, and yes, we made love again. We even had lunch together a couple of times. However, we never discussed where our relationship was heading. The idea of exclusivity didn't cross either of our minds. Our daughter's wedding was approaching rapidly. We had meticulously gone over all the details, and I had proudly covered all the expenses without complaint. The band had made good money playing at festivals. We had paid off the mortgage while still married, had minimal credit card debt, and I had a stable full-time job with a top-tier salary and no dependents to support. While I wasn't swimming in wealth, I was comfortable and had savings in the bank. The only detail we hadn't shared was our travel plans. We had each made separate arrangements, but we were both staying at the hotel where all the guests would gather. When we compared notes, we realized we were booked on the same flight. I invited her to meet me at my house and share the car I had hired to take us to the airport. On the day of the trip, Ellen arrived early. I had barely rinsed out the coffee pot and started the dishwasher with the breakfast dishes when the car pulled into the driveway. Our driver swiftly took us to JFK. After checking our bags curbside, we headed into the terminal together. Since there weren't many direct flights from JFK to Sydney that day, the check-in counter wasn't crowded, and we joined the line together. I stepped up after Ellen, and the counter attendant asked why I hadn't used the shorter line for first-class passengers. Although I had purchased a first-class ticket due to the long flight duration, I typically opted for cheaper fares and hadn't realized the benefits included express check-in. The ticket agent found it amusing and directed me to the first-class lounge. Ellen was waiting for me there, and we cleared security together before heading to the lounge. At the desk, I checked in, and the attendant didn't question Ellen's entry with a coach ticket, but offered to upgrade her to first class to sit next to me. Call me sentimental or whatever else you like, but something about flying halfway around the world with the mother of my daughter to attend her wedding in first-class seats that reclined into beds while she cramped in coach with no leg room just didn't sit right with me. When we boarded the plane by Rose, I made her wait with me. Initially annoyed and worried about losing her seat to a standby passenger, she began to work up a fuss. I explained that I had checked her in when we arrived at the lounge, diffusing her irritation. Of course, any remaining annoyance vanished completely when she was seated beside me in first class, and I presented the mother of the bride rationale. Her mood shifted to a degree that had me briefly entertaining thoughts of joining the Mile High Club. But don't be absurd, dear reader. Public displays of affection aren't my style, especially not in the confines of an airplane lavatory. We landed in Sydney, and the week was pure magic. We toured, visited, and best of all, witnessed my daughter embark on her own marriage journey. I can't express enough how proud I felt uttering my sole line, "Her mother and I do," as I gave her away after walking her down the aisle. At the reception, I escorted Ellen and savored the customary dances. Among the evening's highlights was when her brothers and I joined the band for a spirited rendition of All American Girl, our musical tribute to our little girl. Following the festivities, Ellen, the boys, and I convened in the hotel lounge. One of them cut to the chase. "So what's going on with you two?" "Nothing new, sweetie," Ellen replied. "Your dad and I are simply embracing our roles as your parents. We've moved past our past and are relishing life. Is that all right with you?" "Yeah, Mom, it just seems like more than that. It seems like you're getting close again. Maybe even, I don't know, getting back together." "Honey, I'm not oblivious. I had a moment of insanity a while back and made a foolish mistake." "All right, I was foolish then. Incredibly foolish. I own up to that, and I accept the consequences. Your dad and I have discussed it, and what he said is true. Just like we always taught you, I made a decision. I left the relationship, and I accept the consequences." The boys turned to me for input. Having nothing further to contribute, I sat there with a smile, savoring a delightful local Australian ale. "Come on, Dad," Mom answered the question. "Do we get to hear from you?" "Boys, you should be grateful we didn't spend the week here hurling hurtful remarks at each other. I hear that's what divorced couples often do at events like this. Beyond that, I believe your inquiry generally delves into my romantic life, which is off limits. Didn't I teach you not to kiss and tell? So why would I? But Dad, you love Mom. It's obvious to all of us. And we're both old enough to understand when a girl says she wants to be just friends. So without giving me nightmares and unpleasant mental images of your love life, just tell us, are you and Mom more than just friends? Son, given our history, if we're friendly, it will always surpass mere friendship. She's the love of my life, the mother of my children, and the greatest friend I've ever had. It's one of those things humans can't simply switch on or off. Beyond that, I can't provide an answer, because that part of our life story has yet to be written. We chatted a bit longer before retiring to our respective rooms. Just as I had slipped into my pajamas, there was a knock on the door. It was Ellen. I welcomed her in, and we climbed into bed. She expressed gratitude for the first-class upgrade, and before I could catch my breath, She began thanking me for the wonderful week we'd had. She thanked me for approaching my daughter's wedding as a team and for what I had told the boys in the lounge. Exhausted from the onslaught of gratitude, I could barely keep up. She stayed for breakfast, which I ordered from room service. The journey home felt like a dream. Upon arriving at my house before she left, Ellen gave me a deep kiss. I want you to know that I'm here for you, whatever you want, whenever you want. Somewhere along the line, I forgot why I loved you. Somewhere in the routine of being an adult, I forgot how much I loved you. Leaving you was the biggest mistake I could have made. I threw away the most precious thing I could ever have. Hurting you will always be the biggest regret of my life, and I wish I could turn back the clock. Whatever you need, whenever you need it, just let me know. Need a tennis partner? Call me. Need a roadie? Groupie? Backup singer? I'm your girl. Need a lover? I'm your woman. Whether it's having lovemaking, abusing me, or making love to me, I'm there. Need a meal cooked? I'll do it. I'll clean, fold your laundry, do the dishes and windows. I'll never ask or expect exclusivity. I know I gave that up. But if you ever ask, the answer is yes. Friend, girlfriend, mistress, lover, wife, just ask. Thank you for being you. You're wonderful, and if you ever decide to settle down with someone else, count on me to let her know what she has, and that she better make you happy, or I'll be waiting. That's really sweet of you, Ellen. I've been so happy that we've been able to reconnect. I'm just not sure I'm comfortable putting labels on us. I don't know where we're headed. I'm just glad we're on this journey together, at least part of the time. I've spent my whole life living with women and usually doing their bidding. First my mom and sister, then right after college, marrying you. I kind of enjoy living in a home where I determine the colors and clutter levels. I like cooking my own food the way I like it, and having the fridge stocked with my favorites. I love playing in the band, and I have to admit, having an open lovemaking life has been good for me. I don't plan on changing that anytime soon. Do you remember the note I wrote in response to your letter? Yes, you said I was right, thanked me, and said goodbye. You didn't even sign it love. I meant every word in that note. You were right. We were stagnant and needed a change. The thank you and goodbye were sincere. Anything about love would have felt insincere and out of place. Anything else I could have said would have either been spiteful or made me seem like a pathetic beggar. I'm not good at that. So I wrote what needed to be said and left it at that. What needs to be written now, Tom? Not a thing. I've shown you everything you need to know. Yes, you have. You've shown me that you care. You've shown me you still find me attractive and hot even. You've shown me you want me. You stand by me where the children are concerned. You've shown you love me more than a casual lover, enough even to share dinner and breakfast. You enjoy my company enough to date me. You respect me and our history enough to upgrade me to first class, pay for our daughter's wedding completely without asking a cent from me, and to declare to our sons that I'm the love of our life. The only thing that seems to be missing is a more full-time role, being your wife. I want you to know I understand that and will never press you on that topic. I know I gave that right away, but understand that if you ever choose to ask, the answer is yes in advance, and I'll be praying every day of my life for the chance to say it. With that, she kissed me goodnight. Sure, I considered what she said. But come on, let's be realistic. I may be whipped, but why settle for just one? I had everything I could want. My own home, grown children, financial security, an ex-wife dedicated to winning me back who admitted she'd do anything anytime, a fit body with all my hair, a successful band and a Harley, and a steady stream of women vying to ride on the back of my bike and join me for after-parties. Sure, I loved Ellen enough, and there was that idea of having someone to share my golden years with. But really, maybe I'd change my mind when we hit 60, but not now. I didn't pen a Dear Jeff letter, so I didn't feel accountable for any consequences. I'd forgiven her, made amends, and my life was in order. So I dialed the number of that busty blonde who hopped on my Harley after the street festival and became my first post-divorce fling. She giggled when I asked if she was serious about never hearing from me again. Assuring me she was okay and up for a rendezvous, she invited me over. Even as I revved up the Harley to head to her place, I knew someday I'd propose to Ellen again, but that day wasn't today.